Chapter 17 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. In 10 seconds, it seemed to Kent, Marette Radisson was again the splendid creature who had held the 3 men at bay over the end of her little black gun at barracks. The sound of Mooie's second warning came at first as a shock. Accompanying it, there was a moment of fear driven almost to the point of actual terror. Following it came a reaction so swift that Kent was dazed. Within those 10 seconds, the girl's slender body seemed to grow taller. A new light flamed in her face. Her eyes, turning swiftly to him, were filled with the same fire with which they had faced the 3 constables. She was unafraid. She was ready to fight. In such moments as these, it was the quiet and dispassionate composure of her voice that amazed him most. It was musical in its softness now. Yet in that softness was a hidden thing. It was like velvet covering steel. She had spoken of Niska, the gray goose, the goddess of the 3 rivers. And he thought that something of the spirit of a goddess must be in Marette Radisson to give her the courage with which she faced him, even as the metallic thing outside tapped its warning again at the window. "Inspector Kedsty is coming back," she said. "I did not think he would do that tonight." "He has not had time to go to barracks," said Kent. "No. Possibly he has forgotten something. Before he arrives, I want to show you the nest I have made for you, Jeems. Come quickly." It was her first intimation that he was not to remain in her room, a possibility that had already caused him some inward embarrassment. She seized a number of matches, turned down her light, and hurried into the hall. Kent followed her to the end of this hall, where she paused before a low, half door that apparently opened into some sort of a space close under the sloping roof of the bungalow. "It is an old storeroom," she whispered. "I have made it quite comfortable, I think. I have covered the window, so you may light the lamp. But you must see that no light shows under this door. Lock it on the inside, and be very quiet. For whatever you find in there, you must thank Monsieur Fingers." She pulled the door slightly open and gave him the matches. The illumination in the lower hall made its way only dimly to where they stood. In the gloom he found himself close to the soft glow of her eyes. His fingers closed about her hand as he took the matches. "Marette, you believe me?" he entreated. "You believe that I love you, and that I didn't kill John Barkley, that I am going to fight for you as long as God gives me breath to fight?" For a moment there was silence. Her hand withdrew gently from his. "Yes, I think that I believe. Good night, Jeems." She went from him quickly. At her door she turned. "Go in now, please," she called back softly. "If you care as you say you do, go in." She did not wait for his reply. Her own door closed behind her, and Kent, striking a match, stooped low and entered his hiding place. In a moment he saw directly ahead of him a lamp on a box. He lighted this, and his first movement then was to close the door and turn the key that was in the lock. After that he looked about him. The storeroom was not more than 10 feet square, and the roof was so close over his head that he could not stand upright. It was not the smallness of the place that struck him first, but the preparations which Marette had made for him. In a corner was a bed of blankets, and the rough floor of the place was carpeted with blankets, except for a 2 or 3 foot space around the edge of it. Beyond the box was a table and a chair, and it was the burden of this table that made his pulse jump quickest. Marette had not forgotten that he might grow hungry. It was laid sumptuously, with a plate for one, but with food for half a dozen. There were a brace of roasted grouse, brown as nuts, a cold roast of moose meat or beef, a dish piled high with golden potato salad, olives, pickles, an open can of cherries, a loaf of bread, butter, cheese, and one of Kedsty's treasured thermos bottles, which undoubtedly held hot coffee or tea. And then he noticed what was on the chair: a belt and holster and a Colt automatic .45. Marette had not figured on securing a gun in the affair at barracks, and her foresight had not forgotten a weapon. She had placed it conspicuously where he could not fail to see it at once. And just beyond the chair, on the floor, was a shoulder pack. It was of the regulation service sort, partly filled. Resting against the pack was a Winchester. He recognized the gun. He had seen it hanging in Dirty Fingers' shack. For a matter of 5 minutes he scarcely moved from where he stood beside the table. Nothing but an unplastered roof was between him and the storm, and over his head the thunder crashed and the rain beat in torrents. He saw where the window was, carefully covered with a blanket. Even through the blanket he caught faintly the illumination of lightning. This window overlooked the entrance to Kedsty's bungalow, and the idea came to him of turning out the light and opening it. In darkness he took down the blanket. But the window itself was not movable, and after assuring himself of this fact, he flattened his face against it, peering out into the chaos of the night. In that instant came a flare of lightning, and to Kent, looking down, was revealed a sight that tightened every muscle in his body. More vividly than if it had been day, he saw a man standing below in the deluge. It was not Mooie. It was not Kedsty. It was no one that he had ever seen. Even more like a ghost than a man was that apparition of the lightning flare. A great, gaunt giant of a ghost, bare-headed, with long, dripping hair and a long, storm-twisted beard. The picture shot to his brain with the swiftness of the lightning itself. It was like the sudden throwing of a cinema picture on a screen. Then blackness shut it out. Kent stared harder. He waited. Again came the lightning, and again he saw that tragic, ghost-like figure waiting in the storm. 3 times he saw it, and he knew that the mysterious bearded giant was an old man. The 4th time the lightning came, the figure was gone. And in that flare it was the bowed figure of Kedsty he saw hurrying up the gravel path to the door. Quickly Kent covered the window, but he did not relight the lamp. Before Kedsty could have reached the foot of the stair, he had unlocked the door. Cautiously he opened it 3 or 4 inches and sat down with his back against the wall, listening. He heard Kedsty pass through into the big room where Marette had waited for him a short time before. After that there was silence, except for the tumult of the storm. For an hour Kent listened. In all that time he did not hear a sound from the lower hall or from Marette's room. He wondered if she was sleeping, and if Kedsty had gone to bed, waiting for morning before he set in action his bloodhounds of the law. Kent had no intention of disturbing the comfortable-looking bed of blankets. He was not only sleepless, but filled with a premonition of events about to happen. He felt impinging itself more and more upon him a sense of watchfulness. That Inspector Kedsty and Marette Radisson were under the same roof, and that there was some potent and mysterious reason which kept Kedsty from betraying the girl's presence, was the thought which troubled him most. He was not developing further the plans for his own escape. He was thinking of Marette. What was her power over Kedsty? Why was it that Kedsty would like to see her dead? Why was she in his house? Again and again he asked himself the questions and found no answers to them. And yet, even in this purgatory of mystery that environed him, he felt himself happier than he had ever been in his life. For Marette was not 400 or 500 miles down the river. She was in the same house with him, and he had told her that he loved her. He was glad that he had been given courage to let her know that. He relighted the lamp, and opened his watch and placed it on the table, where frequently he could look at the time. He wanted to smoke his pipe, but the odor of tobacco, he was sure, would reach Kedsty, unless the inspector had actually retired into his bedroom for the night. Half a dozen times he questioned himself as to the identity of the ghostly apparition he had seen in the lightning flare of the storm. Perhaps it was some one of Finger's strange friends from out of the wilderness, Mooie's partner in watching the bungalow. The picture of that giant of a man with his great beard and long hair, as his eyes had caught him in a sea of electrical fire, was indelibly burned into his brain. It was a tragic picture. Again he put out the light and bared the blanketed window, but he saw nothing but the sodden gleam of the earth when the lightning flashed. A second time he opened the door a few inches and sat down with his back to the wall, listening. How long it was before drowsiness stole upon him he did not know, but it came, and for a few moments at a time, as his eyes closed, it robbed him of his caution. And then, for a space, he slept. A sound brought him suddenly into wide wakefulness. His first impression was that the sound had been a cry. For a moment or two, as his senses adjusted themselves, he was not sure. Then, swiftly, the thing grew upon him. He rose to his feet and widened the crack of his door. A bar of light shot across the upper hall. It was from Marette's room. He had taken off his boots to deaden the sound of his feet, and he stepped outside his door. He was positive he heard a low cry, a choking, sobbing cry, only barely audible, and that it came from down the stair. No longer hesitating, he moved quickly to Marette's room and looked in. His first glimpse was of the bed. It had not been used. The room was empty. Something cold and chilling gripped at his heart, and an impulse which he no longer made an effort to resist pulled him to the head of the stair. It was more than an impulse. It was a demand. Step by step he went down, his hand on the butt of his Colt. He reached the lower hall, which was still lighted, and a step or two brought him to a view of the door that opened into the big living room beyond. That door was partly open, and the room itself was filled with light. Soundlessly, Kent approached. He looked in. What he saw first brought him relief together with shock. At one end of the long desk table over which hung a great brass lamp stood Marette. She was in profile to him. He could not see her face. Her hair fell loose about her, glowing like a rich sable cape in the light of the lamp. She was safe, alive, and yet the attitude of her as she looked down was the thing that gave him shock. He was compelled to move a few inches more before he could see what she was staring at. And then his heart stopped dead still. Huddled down in his chair, with his head flung back so that the terrible ghastliness of his face fronted Kent, was Kedsty. And Kent, in an instant, knew. Only a dead man could look like that. With a cry he entered the room. Marette did not start, but an answering cry came into her throat as she turned her eyes from Kedsty to him. To Kent it was like looking upon the dead in two ways. Marette Radisson, living and breathing, was whiter than Kedsty, who was white with the unbreathing pallor of the actually dead. She did not speak. She made no sound after that answering cry in her throat. She simply looked. And Kent spoke her name gently as he saw her great, wide eyes blading dully their agony and despair. Then, like one stunned and fascinated, she stared down upon Kedsty again. Every instinct of the man-hunter came alive in Kent's brain as he, too, turned toward the Inspector of Police. Kedsty's arms hung limp over the side of his chair. On the floor under his right hand was his Colt automatic. His head was strained so far over the back of the chair that it looked as though his neck had been broken. On his forehead, close up against his short-cropped iron-gray hair, was a red stain. Kent approached and bent over him. He had seen death too many times not to recognize it now, but seldom had he seen a face twisted and distorted as Kedsty's was. His eyes were open and bulging in a glassy stare. His jaws hung loose. It was then that Kent's blood froze in his veins. Kedsty had received a blow, but it was not the blow that had killed him. Afterward he had been choked to death, and the thing that had choked him was a tress of woman's hair. In the seconds that followed that discovery, Kent could not have moved if his own life had paid the penalty of inaction. For the story was told, there about Kedsty's throat and on his chest. The tress of hair was long and soft and shining and black. It was twisted twice around Kedsty's neck, and the loose end rippled down over his shoulder, glowing like a bit of rich sable in the lamplight. It was that thought of velvety sable that had come to him at the doorway, looking at Marette. It was the thought that came to him now. He touched it. He took it in his fingers. He unwound it from about Kedsty's neck, where it had made two deep rings in the flesh. From his fingers it rippled out full length, and he turned slowly and faced Marette Radisson. Never had human eyes looked at him as she was looking at him now. She reached out a hand, her lips mute, and Kent gave her the tress of hair. And the next instant she turned, with a hand clasped at her own throat, and passed through the door. After that he heard her going unsteadily up the stairs. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 18 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. Kent did not move. His senses for a space were stunned. He was almost physically insensible to all emotions but that one of shock and horror. He was staring at Kedsty's gray-white, twisted face when he heard Marette's door close. A cry came from his lips, but he did not hear it, was unconscious that he had made a sound. His body shook with a sudden tremor. He could not disbelieve, for the evidence was there. From behind, as he had sat in his chair, Marette Radisson had struck the Inspector of Police with some blunt object. The blow had stunned him, and after that he drew a hand across his eyes as if to clear his vision. What he had seen was impossible. The evidence was impossible. Assaulted, in deadly peril, defending either honor or love, Marette Radisson was of the blood to kill. But to creep up behind her victim, it was inconceivable. Yet there had been no struggle. Even the automatic on the floor gave no evidence of that. Kent picked it up. He looked at it closely, and again the unconscious cry of despair came in a half groan from his lips, for on the butt of the Colt was a stain of blood and a few gray hairs. Kedsty had been stunned by a blow from his own gun. As Kent placed it on the table, his eyes caught suddenly a gleam of steel under the edge of a newspaper, and he drew out from their hiding place the long-bladed clipping scissors which Kedsty had used in the preparation of his scrapbooks and official reports. It was the last link in the deadly evidence, the automatic with its telltale stain, the scissors, the tress of hair, and Marette Radisson. He felt a sensation of sudden dizziness. Every nerve center in his body had received its shock, and when the shock had passed it left him sweating. Swiftly the reaction came. It was a lie, he told himself. The evidence was false. Marette could not have committed that crime, as the crime had visualized itself before his eyes. There was something which he had not seen, something which he could not see, something that was hiding itself from him. He became in an instant the old James Kent. The instinctive processes of the man-hunter leaped to their stations like trained soldiers. He saw Marette again, as she had looked at him when he entered the room. It was not murder he had caught in her wide-open eyes. It was not hatred. It was not madness. It was a quivering, bleeding soul crying out to him in an agony that no other human eyes had ever revealed to him before. And suddenly a great voice cried out in his brain, drowning all other things, telling him how contemptible a thing was love, unless in that love was faith. With his heart choking him, he turned again to Kedsty. The futility of the thing which he had told himself was faith gripped at him sickeningly, yet he fought for that faith, even as his eyes looked again upon the ghastly torture that was in Kedsty's face. He was becoming calmer. He touched the dead man's cheek and found that it was no longer warm. The tragedy must have occurred an hour before. He examined more closely the abrasion on Kedsty's forehead. It was not a deep wound, and the blow that had made it must have stunned the inspector of police for only a short time. In that space the other thing had happened. In spite of his almost superhuman effort to keep the picture away from him, Kent saw it vividly, the swift turning to the table, the inspiration of the scissors, the clipping of the long tress of hair, the choking to death of Kedsty as he regained consciousness. Over and over again he whispered to himself the impossibility of it, the absurdity of it, the utter incongruity of it. Only a brain gone mad would have conceived that monstrous way of killing Kedsty. And Marette was not mad. She was sane. Like the eyes of a hunting ferret, his own eyes swept quickly about the room. At the 4 windows there were long curtain cords. On the walls, hung there as trophies, were a number of weapons. On one end of Kedsty's desk, used as a paperweight, was a stone tomahawk. Still nearer to the dead man's hands, unhidden by papers, was a bootlace. Under his limp right hand was the automatic. With these possible instruments of death close at hand, ready to be snatched up without trouble or waste of time, why had the murderer used a tress of woman's hair? The bootlace drew Kent's eyes. It was impossible not to see it, 48 inches long and 1/4 inch wide buckskin. He began seeking for its mate, and found it on the floor where Marette Radisson had been standing. And again the unanswerable question pounded in Kent's brain. Why had Kedsty's murderer used a tress of hair instead of a buckskin lace or one of the curtain cords hanging conspicuously at the windows? He went to each of these windows and found them locked. Then, a last time, he bent over Kedsty. He knew that in the final moments of his life Kedsty had suffered a slow and torturing agony. His twisted face left the story. And the inspector of police was a powerful man. He had struggled, still partly dazed by the blow. But it had taken strength to overcome him even then, to hold his head back, to choke life out of him slowly with the noose of hair. And Kent, now that the significance of what he saw began to grow upon him more clearly, felt triumphing over all other things in his soul a slow and mighty joy. It was inconceivable that with the strength of her own hands and body Marette Radisson had killed Kedsty. A greater strength than hers had held him in the death chair, and a greater strength than hers had choked life from the inspector of police. He drew slowly out of the room, closing the door noiselessly behind him. He found that the front door was as Kedsty had left it, unlocked. Close to that door he stood for a space, scarcely allowing himself to breathe. He listened, but no sound came down the dimly illuminated stairway. A new thing was pressing upon him now. It rode over the shock of tragedy, over the first roused instincts of the man-hunter, overwhelming him with the realization of a horror such as had never confronted him before. It gripped him more fiercely than the mere killing of Kedsty. His thought was of Marette, of the fate which dawn and discovery would bring for her. His hands clenched and his jaws tightened. The world was against him, and tomorrow it would be against her. Only he, in the face of all that condemning evidence in the room beyond, would disbelieve her guilty of Kedsty's death. And he, Jim Kent, was already a murderer in the eyes of the law. He felt within him the slow growing inspiration of a new spirit, the gathering might of a new force. A few hours ago he was an outcast. He was condemned. Life, for him, had been robbed of its last hope. And in that hour of his grimmest despair, Marette Radisson had come to him. Through storm that had rocked the earth under her feet and set ablaze the chaotic blackness of the sky over her head, she had struggled, for him. She had counted no cost. She had measured no chances. She had simply come because she believed in him. And now, upstairs, she was the victim of the terrible price that was the first cost of his freedom. For he believed, now that the thought came to him like a dagger stroke, that this was so. Her act in freeing him had brought about the final climax, and as a result of it, Kedsty was dead. He went to the foot of the stair. Quietly, in his shoeless feet, he began to climb them. He wanted to cry out Marette's name even before he came to the top. He wanted to reach up to her with his arms outstretched. But he came silently to her door and looked in. She lay in a crumpled, huddled heap on her bed. Her face was hidden, and all about her lay her smothering hair. For a moment he was frightened. He could not see that she was breathing. So still was she that she was like one dead. His footsteps were unheard as he moved across the room. He knelt down beside her, reached out his arms, and gathered her into them. "Marette!" he cried in a low voice. He felt the sudden quiver, like a little shock, that ran through her. He crushed his face down so that it lay in her hair, still damp from its wetting. He drew her closer, tightening his arms about her slender body, and a little cry came from her, a cry that was a broken thing, a sob without tears. "Marette!" It was all he said. It was all he could say in that moment when his heart was beating like a drum against her breast. And then he felt the slow pressure of her hands against him, saw her white face, her wide, staring eyes within a few inches of his own, and she drew away from him, back against the wall, still huddled like a child on the bed, with her eyes fixed on him in a way that frightened him. There were no tears in them. She had not been crying. But her face was as white as he had seen it down in Kedsty's room. Some of the horror and shock had gone out of it. In it was another look as her eyes glowed upon Kent. It was a look of incredulity, of disbelief, a thing slowly fading away under the miracle of an amazing revelation. The truth thrust itself upon him. Marette had not expected that he would come to her like this. She had believed that he would take flight into the night, escaping from her as he would have run from a plague. She put up her two hands, in the trick they had of groping at her white throat, and her lips formed a word which she did not speak. Kent, to his own amazement, was smiling and still on his knees. He pulled himself to his feet and stood up straight, looking down at her in that same strange, comforting, all-powerful way. The thrill of it was passing into her veins. A flush of color was driving the deathly pallor from her face. Her lips were parted, and she breathed quickly, a little excitedly. "I thought you would go," she said. "Not without you," he said. "I have come to take you with me." He drew out his watch. It was 2:00. He held it down so that she could look at the dial. "If the storm keeps up, we have 3 hours before dawn," he said. "How soon can you be ready, Marette?" He was fighting to make his voice quiet and unexcited. It was a terrific struggle. And Marette was not blind to it. She drew herself from the bed and stood up before him, her two hands still clasped at her throbbing throat. "You believe that I killed Kedsty," she said in a voice that was forced from her lips. "And you have come to help me, to pay me for what I tried to do for you? That is it, Jeems?" "Pay you?" he cried. "I couldn't pay you in a million years. From that day you first came to Cardigan's place, you gave me life. You came when the last spark of hope in me had died. I shall always believe that I would have died that night. But you saved me. From the moment I saw you, I loved you, and I believe it was that love that kept me alive. And then you came to me again, down there, through this storm. Pay you? I can't. I never shall be able to. Because you thought I had killed a man made no difference. You came just the same, and you came ready to kill, if necessary, for me. I'm not trying to tell myself why, but you did. You were ready to kill, and I am ready to kill, tonight, for you. I haven't got time to think about Kedsty. I'm thinking about you. If you killed him, I'm just telling myself there was a mighty good reason for it. But I don't believe it was you who killed him. You couldn't do it, with those hands." He reached out suddenly and seized them, slipping his grip to her wrists so that her hands lay upward in his own, hands that were small, slim-fingered, soft-palmed, beautiful. "They couldn't!" he cried, almost fiercely. "I swear to God they couldn't!" Her eyes and face flamed at his words. "You believe that, Jeems?" "Yes, just as you believe that I did not kill John Barkley. But the world is against us. It is against us both now, and we've got to hunt that hidden valley of yours together. Understand, Marette? And I'm rather glad." He turned toward the door. "Will you be ready in 10 minutes?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, in 10 minutes." He ran out into the hall and down the stair, locking the front door. Then he returned to his hiding place under the roof. He knew that a strange sort of madness was in his blood, for in the face of tonight's tragedy only madness could inspire him with the ecstatic thrill that was in his veins. Kedsty's death seemed far removed from a more important thing, the fact that from this hour Marette was his to fight for, that she belonged to him, that she must go with him. He loved her. In spite of whoever she was and whatever she had done, he loved her. Very soon she would tell him what had happened in the room below, and the thing would be clear. There was one little corner of his brain that fought him. It kept telling him, like a parrot, that it was a tress of Marette's hair about Kedsty's throat, and that it was the hair that had choked him. But Marette would explain that too. He was sure of it. In the face of the facts below he was illogical and unreasonable. He knew it. But his love for this girl, who had come strangely and tragically into his life, was like an intoxicant. And his faith was illimitable. She did not kill Kedsty. Another part of his brain kept repeating that over and over, even as he recalled that only a few hours before she had told him quite calmly that she would kill the inspector of police, if a certain thing should happen. His hands worked as swiftly as his thoughts. He laced up his service boots. All the food and dishes on the table he made into a compact bundle and placed in the shoulder pack. He carried this and the rifle out into the hall. Then he returned to Marette's room. The door was closed. At his knock, the girl's voice told him that she was not quite ready. He waited. He could hear her moving about quickly in her room. An interval of silence followed. Another 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. He tapped at the door again. This time it was opened. He stared, amazed at the change in Marette. She had stepped back from the door to let him enter, and stood full in the lamp glow. Her slim, beautiful body was dressed in a velvety blue corduroy. The coat was close-fitting and boyish. The skirt came only a little below her knees. On her feet were high-topped caribou boots. About her waist was a holster and the little black gun. Her hair was done up and crowded under a close-fitting turban. She was exquisitely lovely as she stood there waiting for him, and in that loveliness Kent saw there was not one thing out of place. The corduroy, the turban, the short skirt, and the high, laced boots were made for the wilderness. She was not a tenderfoot. She was a little sourdough, clear through. Gladness leaped into Kent's face. But it was not the transformation of her dress alone that amazed him. She was changed in another way. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes glowed with a strange and wonderful radiance as she looked at him. Her lips were red, as he had seen them that first time at Cardigan's place. Her pallor, her fear, her horror were gone, and in their place was the repressed excitement of one about to enter upon a strange adventure. On the floor was a pack only half as large as Kent's, and when he picked it up, he found it of almost no weight. He fastened it to his own pack, while Marette put on her raincoat and went down the stair ahead of him. In the hall below, she was waiting, when he came down, with Kedsty's big rubber slicker in her hands. "You must put it on," she said. She shuddered slightly as she held the garment. The color was almost gone from her cheeks as she faced the door beyond which the dead man sat in his chair, but the marvelous glow was still in her eyes as she helped Kent with his pack and the slicker, and afterward stood for an instant with her hands touching his breast, and her lips as if about to speak something which she held back. A few steps beyond them they heard the storm. It seemed to rush upon the bungalow in a new fury, beating at the door, crashing over their heads in thunder, daring them to come out. Kent reached up and turned out the hall light. In darkness he opened the door. Rain and wind swept in. With his free hand he groped out, found Marette, drew her after him, and closed the door again. Entering from the lighted hall into the storm was like being swallowed in a pit of blackness. It engulfed and smothered them. Then came suddenly a flash of lightning, and he saw Marette's face, white and drenched, but looking at him with that same strange glow in her eyes. It thrilled him. Even in the darkness it was there. It had been there since he had returned to her from Kedsty and had knelt at her bedside, with his arms about her for a moment. Only now, in the beat of the storm, did an answer to the miracle of it come to him. It was because of him. It was because of his faith in her. Even death and horror could not keep it from her eyes. He wanted to cry out the joy of his discovery, to give wild voice to it in the teeth of the wind and the rain. He felt sweeping through him a force mightier than that of the night. Her hands were on his arm, as if she was afraid of losing him in that pit of blackness. The soft cling of them was like a contact through which came a warm thrill of electrical life. He put out his arm and drew her to him, so that for a moment his face pressed against the top of her wet little turban. And then he heard her say, "There is a scow at the bayou, Jeems. It is close to the end of the path. Monsieur Fingers has kept it there, waiting, ready." He had been thinking of Crossen's place and an open boat. He blessed Fingers again as he took Marette's hand in his own and started for the trail that led through the poplar thicket. Their feet slopped deep in wet and mud, and with the rain there was a wind that took their breath away. It was impossible to see a tree an arm's length away, and Kent hoped that the lightning would come frequently enough to guide him. In the first flare of it he looked down the slope that led riverward. Little rivulets of water were running down it. Rocks and stumps were in their way, and underfoot it was slippery. Marette's fingers were clinging to his again, as she had held to them on the wild race up to Kedsty's bungalow from the barracks. He had tingled then in the sheer joy of their thrill, but it was a different thrill that stirred him now, an overwhelming emotion of possessorship. This night, with its storm and its blackness, was the most wonderful of all his nights. He sensed nothing of its discomfort. It could not beat back the joyous racing of his blood in his body. Sun and stars, day and night, sunshine and cloud, were trivial and inconsequential to him now. For close to him, struggling with him, fighting through the night with him, trusting him, helpless without him, was the living, breathing thing he loved more than he loved his own life. For many years, without knowing it, he had waited for this night, and now it was upon him. It inundated and swept away his old life. He was no longer the huntsman, but the hunted. He was no longer alone, but had a priceless thing to fight for, a priceless and helpless thing that was clinging to his fingers in the darkness. He did not feel like a fugitive, but as one who has come into a great triumph. He sensed no uncertainty or doubt. The river lay ahead, and for him the river had become the soul and the promise of life. It was Marette's river and his river, and in a little while they would be on it. And Marette would then tell him about Kedsty. He was sure of that. She would tell him what had happened while he slept. His faith was illimitable. They came into the sodden dip at the foot of the ridge, and the lightning revealed to him the edge of the poplar growth in which O'Connor had seen Marette many weeks ago. The bayou trail wound through this, and Kent struck out for it blindly in the darkness. He did not try to talk, but he freed his companion's hand and put his arm about her when they came to the level ground, so that she was sheltered by him from the beat of the storm. Then brush swished in their faces, and they stopped, waiting for the lightning again. Kent was not anxious for it to come. He drew the girl still closer, and in that pit of blackness, with the deluge about her and the crash of thunder over her head, she snuggled up against his breast, the throb of her body against him, waiting, watching with him. Her frailty, the helplessness of her, the slimness of her in the crook of his arm, filled him with an exquisite exultation. He did not think of her now as the splendid, fearless creature who had leveled her little black gun at the 3 men in barracks. She was no longer the mysterious, defiant, unafraid person who had held him in a sort of awe that first hour in Kedsty's place. For she was crumpled against him now, utterly dependent and afraid. In that chaos of storm something told him that her nerve was broken, that without him she would be lost and would cry out in fear. And he was glad. He held her tighter. He bent his head until his face touched the wet, crushed hair under the edge of her turban. And then the lightning split open the night again, and he saw the way ahead of him to the trail. Even in darkness it was not difficult to follow in the clean-cut wagon path. Over their heads the tops of the poplars swished and wailed. Under their feet the roadway in places was a running stream, or inundated until it became a pool. In pitch blackness they struck such a pool, and in spite of the handicap of his packs and rifle, Kent stopped suddenly, and picked Marette up in his arms and carried her until they reached high ground. He did not ask permission. And Marette, for a minute or two, lay crumpled up close in his arms, and for a thrilling instant his face touched her rain-wet cheek. The miracle of their adventure was that neither spoke. To Kent the silence between them had become a thing which he had no desire to break. In that silence, excused and abetted by the tumult of the storm, he felt that a wonderful something was drawing them closer and closer together, and that words might spoil the indescribable magic of the thing that was happening. When he set Marette on her feet again, her hand accidentally fell upon his, and for a moment her fingers closed upon it in a soft pressure that meant more to him than 1,000 words of gratitude. A quarter of a mile beyond the poplar thicket they came to the edge of the spruce and cedar timber, and soon the thick walls of the forest shut them in, sheltering them from the wind. But the blackness was even more like that of a bottomless pit. Kent had noticed that the thunder and lightning were drifting steadily eastward, and now the occasional flashes of electrical fire scarcely illumined the track ahead of them. The rain was not beating so fiercely. They could hear the wail of the spruce and cedar tops, and the slush of their boots in mud and water. An interval came, where the spruce tops met overhead, when it was almost calm. It was then that Kent threw out of him a great deep breath and laughed joyously and exultantly. "Are you wet, little Gray Goose?" "Only outside, Big Otter. My feathers have kept me dry." Her voice had a trembling, half-sobbing, half-rejoicing note in it. It was not the voice of one who had recently killed a man. In it was a pathos which Kent knew she was trying to hide behind brave words. Her hands clung to the arm of his rubber slicker even as they stood there, close together, as if she was afraid something might drag them apart in that treacherous gloom. Kent, fumbling for a moment, drew from an inner pocket a dry handkerchief. Then he found her face, tilted it a bit upward, and wiped it dry. He might have done the same thing to a child who had been crying. After that he scrubbed his own, and they went on, his arm about her again. It was 1/2 a mile from the edge of the forest to the bayou, and 1/2 a dozen times in that distance Kent took the girl in his arms and carried her through water that almost reached his boot tops. The lightning no longer served them. The rain still fell steadily, but the wind had gone with the eastward sweep of the storm. Close hung with the forest walls, The bayou itself was indiscernible in the blackness. Marette guided him now, though Kent walked ahead of her, holding firmly to her hand. Unless Fingers had changed its location, the scow should be somewhere within 40 or 50 paces of the end of the trail. It was small, a two-man scow, with a tight little house built amidships. And it was tied close up against the shore. Marette told him this, as they felt their way through brush and reeds. Then he stumbled against something taut and knee-high, and he found it was the tie-rope. Leaving Marette with her back to the anchor tree, he went aboard. The water was 3 or 4 inches deep in the bottom of the scow, but the cabin was built on a platform raised above the floor of the boat, and Kent hoped it was still dry. He groped until he found the twisted wire which held the door shut. Opening it, he ducked his head low and entered. The little room was not more than 4 feet high, and for greater convenience he fell upon his knees while fumbling under his slicker for his waterproof box of matches. The water had not yet risen above the floor. The first light he struck revealed the interior to him. It was a tiny cabin, scarcely larger than some boxes he had seen. It was about 8 feet long by 6 in width, and the ceiling was so low that, even kneeling, his head touched it. His match burned out, and he lighted another. This time he saw a candle stuck in a bit of split birch that projected from the wall. He crept to it and lighted it. For a moment he looked about him, and again he blessed Fingers. The little scow was prepared for a voyage. 2 narrow bunks were built at the far end, one so close above the other that Kent grinned as he thought of squeezing between. There were blankets. Within reach of his arm was a tiny stove, and close to the stove a supply of kindling and dry wood. The whole thing made him think of a child's playhouse. Yet there was still room for a wide, comfortable, cane-bottomed chair, a stool, and a smooth-planed board fastened under a window, so that it answered the purpose of a table. This table was piled with many packages. He stripped off his packs and returned for Marette. She had come to the edge of the scow, and called to him softly as she heard him splashing through the water. Her arms were reaching toward him to meet him in the darkness. He carried her through the shallow sea about his feet, and laughed as he put her down on the edge of the platform at the door. It was a low, joyous laugh. The yellow light of the candles sputtered in their wet faces. Only dimly could he see her, but her eyes were shining. "Your nest, little gray goose," he cried gently. Her hand reached up and touched his face. "You have been good to me, Jeems," she said, a little tremble in her voice. "You may kiss me." Out in the beat of the rain, Kent's heart choked him with song. His soul swelled with the desire to shout forth a paean of joy and triumph at the world he was leaving this night for all time. With the warm thrill of Marette's lips he had become the Superman, and as he leaped ashore in the darkness and cut the tie-rope with a single slash of his knife, he wanted to give voice to the thing that was in him as the rivermen had chanted in the glory of their freedom the day the big brigade started north. And he did sing, under his laughing, sobbing breath. With a giant's strength he sent the scow out into the bayou, and then back and forth he swung the long one-man sweep, twisting the craft riverward with the force of 2 pairs of arms instead of 1. Behind the closed door of the tiny cabin was all that the world now held worth fighting for. By turning his head, he could see the faint illumination of the candle at the window. The light. The cabin. Marette. He laughed inanely, foolishly, like a boy. He began to hear a dull, droning murmur, a sound that with each stroke of the sweep grew into a more distinct, cataract-like roar. It was the river. Swollen by flood, it was a terrifying sound. But Kent did not dread it. It was his river. It was his friend. It was the pulse and throb of life to him now. The growing tumult of it was not menace, but the joyous thunder of many voices calling to him, rejoicing at his coming. It grew in his ears. Over his head the black sky opened again, and a deluge of rain fell straight down. But above the sound of it, the rush of the river drew nearer and still nearer. He felt the first eddying swirl of it against the scow head, and powerful hands seemed to reach in out of the darkness. He knew that the nose of the current had caught him and was carrying him out on the breast of the stream. He shipped the sweep and straightened himself, facing the utter chaos of blackness ahead. He felt under him the slow and mighty pulse of the great flood as it swept toward the Slave, the Mackenzie, and the Arctic. And he cried out at last in the downpour of storm a cry of joy, of exultation, of hope that reached beyond the laws of men. And then he turned toward the little cabin, where through the thickness of sodden night the tiny window was glowing yellow with candlelight. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. To the cabin Kent groped his way, and knocked, and it was Marette who opened the door for him and stepped back for him to enter. Like a great wet dog he came in, doubling until his hands almost touched the floor. He sensed the incongruity of it, the misplacement of his overgrown body in this playhouse thing, and he grinned through the trickles of wet that ran down his face, and tried to see. Marette had taken off her turban and raincoat, and she, too, stooped low in the 4 feet space of the cabin, but not so ridiculously low as Kent. He dropped on his knees again. And then he saw in the tiny stove a fire was burning. The crackle of it rose above the beat of the rain on the roof, and the air was already mellowing with the warmth of it. He looked at Marette. Her wet hair was still clinging to her face, her feet and arms and part of her body were wet, but her eyes were shining, and she was smiling at him. She seemed to him, in this moment, like a child that was glad it had found refuge. He had thought that the terror of the night would show in her face, but it was gone. She was not thinking of the thunder and the lightning, the black trail, or of Kedsty lying dead in his bungalow. She was thinking of him. He laughed outright. It was a joyous, thrilling thing, this black night with the storm over their heads and the roll of the great river under them. They two, alone, in this cockleshell cabin that was not high enough to stand in, and scarcely big enough in any direction to turn around in. The snug cheer of it, the warmth of the fire beginning to reach their chilled bodies, and the inspiring crackle of the birch in the little stove filled Kent, for a space, with other thoughts than those of the world they were leaving. And Marette, whose eyes and lips were smiling at him softly in the candle glow, seemed also to have forgotten. It was the little window that brought them back to the tragedy of their flight. Kent visioned it as it must look from the shore, a telltale blotch of light traveling through the darkness. There were occasional cabins for several miles below the landing, and eyes turned riverward in the storm might see it. He made his way to the window and fastened his slicker over it. "We're off, Gray Goose," he said then, rubbing his hands. "Would it seem more homelike if I smoked?" She nodded, her eyes on the slicker at the window. "It's pretty safe," said Kent, fishing out his pipe and beginning to fill it. "Everybody asleep, probably. But we won't take any chances." The scow was swinging sideways in the current. Kent felt the change in its movement, and added, "No danger of being wrecked, either. There isn't a rock or rapids for 30 miles. River clear as a floor. If we bump ashore, don't get frightened." "I'm not afraid of the river," she said. Then, with rather startling unexpectedness, she asked him, "Where will they look for us tomorrow?" Kent lighted his pipe, eyeing her a bit speculatively as she seated herself on the stool, leaning toward him as she waited for an answer to her question. "The woods, the river, everywhere," he said. "They'll look for a missing boat, of course. We've simply got to watch behind us and take advantage of a good start." "Will the rain wipe out our footprints, Jeems?" "Yes, everything in the open." "But perhaps in a sheltered place?" "We were in no sheltered place," he assured her. "Can you remember that we were, Gray Goose?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but there was Mooie under the window." "His footprints will be wiped out." "I am glad. I would not have him, or Monsieur Fingers, or any of our friends brought into this trouble." She made no effort to hide the relief his words brought her. He was a little amazed that she should worry over Fingers and the old Indian in this hour of their own peril. That danger he had decided to keep as far from her mind as possible. But she could not help realizing the impending menace of it. She must know that within a few hours Kedsty would be found, and the long arm of the wilderness police would begin its work. And if it caught them... She had thrust her feet toward him and was wriggling them inside her boots, so that he heard the slushing sound of water. "Ugh, but they are wet," she shivered. "Will you unlace them and pull them off for me, Jeems?" He laid his pipe aside and knelt close to her. It took him 5 minutes to get the boots off. Then he held one of her sodden little feet close between his two big hands. "Cold, cold as ice," he said. "You must take off your stockings, Marette, please." He arranged a pile of wood in front of the stove and covered it with a blanket which he pulled from one of the bunks. Then, still on his knees, he drew the cane chair close to the fire and covered it with a second blanket. A few moments later, Marette was tucked comfortably in this chair, with her bare feet on the blanketed pile of wood. Kent opened the stove door. Then he extinguished one of the smoking candles, and after that the other. The flaming birch illumined the little cabin with a mellower light. It gave a subdued flush to the girl's face. Her eyes seemed to Kent wonderfully soft and beautiful in that changed light. And when he had finished, she reached out a hand, and for an instant it touched his face and his wet hair so lightly that he sensed the thrilling caress of it without feeling its weight. "You are so good to me, Jeems," she said, and he thought there was a little choking note in her throat. He had seated himself on the floor, close to her chair, with his back to the wall. "It is because I love you, Gray Goose," he replied quietly, looking straight into the fire. She was silent. She, too, was looking into the fire. Close over their heads they heard the beating of the rain, like 1,000 soft little fists pounding the top of the cabin. Under them they could feel the slow swinging of the scow as it responded to the twists and vagaries of the current that was carrying them on. And Kent, unseen by the girl who was looking away from him, raised his eyes. The birch light was glowing in her hair. It trembled on her white throat. Her long lashes were caught in the shimmer of it. And, looking at her, Kent thought of Kedsty lying back in his bungalow room, choked to death by a tress of that glorious hair, so near to him now that, by leaning a little forward, he might have touched it with his lips. The thought brought him no horror, for even as he looked, one of her hands crept up to her cheek, the small, soft hand that had touched his face and hair as lightly as a bit of thistle down, and he knew that two hands like that could not have killed a man who was fighting for life when he died. And Kent reached up and took the hand, and held it close in his own as he said, "Little Gray Goose, please tell me now. What happened in Kedsty's room?" His voice thrilled with an immeasurable faith. He wanted her to know, no matter what had happened, that his faith and his love for her could not be shaken. He believed in her, and would always believe in her. Already he was sure that he knew how Kedsty had died. The picture of the tragedy had pieced itself together in his mind, bit by bit. While he slept, Marette and a man were down in the big room with the inspector of police. The climax had come, and Kedsty was struck a blow, in some unaccountable way, with his own gun. Then, just as Kedsty was recovering sufficiently from the shock of the blow to fight, Marette's companion had killed him. Horrified, dazed by what had already happened, perhaps unconscious, she had been powerless to prevent the use of a tress of her hair in the murderer's final work. Kent, in this picture, eliminated the bootlaces and the curtain cords. He knew that the unusual and the least expected happened frequently in crime. And Marette's long hair was flowing loose about her. To use it had simply been the first inspiration of the murderer. And Kent believed, as he waited for her answer now, that Marette would tell him this. And as he waited, he felt her fingers tighten in his hand. "Tell me, Gray Goose, what happened?" "I don't know, Jeems." His eyes went to her suddenly from the fire, as if he was not quite sure he had heard what she had said. She did not move her head, but continued to gaze unseeingly into the flames. Inside his palm her fingers worked to his thumb and held it tightly again, as they had clung to it when she was frightened by the thunder and lightning. "I don't know what happened, Jeems." This time he did not feel the clinging thrill of her little fingers and soft palm. Deep within him he experienced something that was like a sudden and unexpected blow. He was ready to fight for her until his last breath was gone. He was ready to believe anything she told him, anything except this impossible thing which she had just spoken. For she did know what had happened in Kedsty's room. She knew, unless... Suddenly his heart leaped with joyous hope. "You mean you were unconscious?" he cried in a low voice that trembled with his eagerness. "You fainted, and it happened then?" She shook her head. "No, I was asleep in my room. I didn't intend to sleep, but I did. Something awakened me. I thought I had been dreaming, but something kept pulling me downstairs. And when I went, I found Kedsty like that. He was dead. I was paralyzed, standing there when you came." She drew her hand away from him, gently but significantly. "I know you can't believe me, Jeems. It is impossible for you to believe me." "And you don't want me to believe you, Marette?" "Yes, I do. You must believe me." "But the tress of hair, your hair, round Kedsty's neck." He stopped. His words, spoken gently as they were, seemed brutal to him. Yet he could not see that they affected her. She did not flinch. He saw no tremor of horror. Steadily she continued to look into the fire. And his brain grew confused. Never in all his experience had he seen such absolute and unaffected self-control. And somehow it chilled him. It chilled him even as he wanted to reach out and gather her close in his arms, and pour his love into her ears, entreating her to tell him everything, to keep nothing back from him that might help in the fight he was going to make. And then she said, "Jeems, if we should be caught by the police, it would probably be quite soon, wouldn't it?" "They won't catch us." "But our greatest danger of being caught is right now, isn't it?" she insisted. Kent took out his watch and leaned over to look at it in the fire-glow. "It is 3 o'clock," he said. "Give me another day and night, Gray Goose, and the police will never find us." For a moment or two more she was silent. Then her hand reached out, and her fingers twined softly around his thumb again. "Jeems, when we are safe, when we are sure the police won't find us, I will tell you all that I know about what happened in Kedsty's room. And I will tell you about the hair. I will tell you everything." Her fingers tightened almost fiercely. "Everything," she repeated. "I will tell you about that in Kedsty's room, and I will tell you about myself. And after that, I am afraid you won't like me." "I love you," he said, making no movement to touch her. "No matter what you tell me, Gray Goose, I shall love you." She gave a little cry, scarcely more than a broken note in her throat, and Kent, had her face been turned toward him then, would have seen the glory that came into it, and into her eyes, like a swift flash of light, and passed as swiftly away. What he did see, when she turned her head, were eyes caught suddenly by something at the cabin door. He looked. Water was trickling in slowly over the sill. "I expected that," he said cheerfully. "Our scow is turning into a rain barrel, Marette. Unless I bail out, we'll soon be flooded." He reached for his slicker and put it on. "It won't take me long to throw the water overboard," he added. "And while I'm doing that, I want you to take off your wet things and tuck yourself into bed. Will you, Gray Goose?" "I'm not tired, but if you think it is best—" Her hand touched his arm. "It is best," he said, and for a moment he bent over her until his lips touched her hair. Then he seized a pail and went out into the rain. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 20 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. It was that hour when, with clear skies, the gray northern dawn would have been breaking faintly over the eastern forests. Kent found the darkness more fog-like. About him was a grayer, ghostlier sort of gloom. But he could not see the water under his feet, nor could he see the rail of the scow or the river. From the stern, 10 feet from the cabin door, the cabin itself was swallowed up and invisible. With the steady, swinging motion of the riverman he began bailing. So regular became his movements that they ran in a sort of rhythmic accompaniment to his thoughts. The monotonous splash, splash, splash of the outflung pails of water assumed, after a few minutes, the character of a mechanical thing. He could smell the nearness of the shore. Even in the rain, the tang of cedar and balsam came to him faintly. But it was the river that impressed itself most upon his senses. It seemed to him, as the minutes passed, like a living thing. He could hear it gurgling and playing under the end of the scow. And with that sound there was another and more indescribable thing, the tremble of it, the pulse of it, the thrill of it in the impenetrable gloom, the life of it as it swept on in a slow and mighty flood between its wilderness walls. Kent had always said, "You can hear the river's heartbeat if you know how to listen for it." And he heard it now. He felt it. The rain could not beat it out, nor could the splash of the water he was throwing overboard drown it, and the darkness could not hide it from the vision that was burning like a living coal within him. Always it was the river that had given him consolation in times of loneliness. For him it had grown into a thing with a soul, a thing that personified hope, courage, comradeship, everything that was big and great in final achievement. And tonight, for he still thought of the darkness as night, the soul of it seemed whispering to him a sort of paean. He could not lose. That was the thought that filled him. Never had his pulse beat with greater assurance. Never had a more positive sense of the inevitable possessed him. It was inconceivable, he thought, even to fear the possibility of being taken by the police. He was more than a man fighting for his freedom alone, more than an individual struggling for the right to exist. A thing vastly more priceless than either freedom or life, if they were to be accepted alone, waited for him in the little cabin, shut in by its sea of darkness. And ahead of them lay their world. He emphasized that. Their world. The world which, in an elusive and unreal sort of way, had been a part of his dreams all his life. In that world they would shut themselves in. No one would ever find them. And the glory of the sun and the stars and God's open country would be with them always. Marette was the very heart of that reality which impinged itself upon him now. He did not worry about what it was she would tell him tomorrow, or day after tomorrow. He believed that it was then, when she had told him what there was to tell and he still reached out his arms to her, that she would have come into those arms. And he knew that nothing that might have happened in Kedsty's room would keep his arms from reaching to her. Such was his faith, potent as the mighty flood hidden in the gray ghost gloom of approaching dawn. Yet he did not expect to win easily. As he worked, his mind swept up and down the three rivers from the Landing to Fort Simpson, and mentally he pictured the situations that might arise, and how he would triumph over them. He figured that the man at barracks would not enter Kedsty's bungalow until noon at the earliest. The police gasoline launch would probably set out on a river search soon after. By mid-afternoon the scow would have a 50-mile start. Before darkness came again they would be through the Death Chute, where Follette and La Douceur swam their mad race for the love of a girl. And not many miles below the chute was a swampy country where he could hide the scow. Then they would start overland, west and north. Given until another sunset, and they would be safe. This was what he expected. But if it came to fighting, he would fight. The rain had slackened to a thin drizzle by the time he finished his bailing. The aroma of cedar and balsam came up to him more clearly, and he heard more distinctly the murmuring surge of the river. He tapped again at the door of the cabin, and Marette answered him. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals when he entered. Again he fell on his knees, and took off his dripping slicker. The girl greeted him from the berth. "You look like a great bear, Jeems." There was a glad, welcoming note in her voice. He laughed, and drew the stool beside her, and managed to sit on it, the roof compelling him to bend his head over a little. "I feel like an elephant in a bird cage," he replied. "Are you comfortable, little Gray Goose?" "Yes. But you, Jeems, you are wet." "But so happy that I don't feel it, Gray Goose." He could make her out only dimly there in the darkness of the berth. Her face was a pale shadow, and she had loosened her damp hair so that the warmth and dry air might reach it more easily. Kent wondered if she could hear the beating of his heart. He forgot the fire, and the darkness grew thicker. He could no longer see the pale outline of her face, and he drew back a little, possessed by the thought that it was sacrilegious to bend nearer to her like a thief in that gloom. She sensed his movement, and her hand reached to him and lay lightly with its fingertips touching his arm. "Jeems," she said softly, "I'm not sorry now that I came up to Cardigan's place that day when you thought you were dying. I wasn't wrong. You are different. And I made fun of you then, and laughed at you, because I knew that you were not going to die. Will you forgive me?" He laughed happily. "It's funny how little things work out sometimes," he said. "Wasn't a king lost once upon a time because some fellow didn't have a horseshoe? Anyway, I knew of a man whose life was saved because of a broken pipe stem. And you came to me, and I'm here with you now, because—" "Of what?" she whispered. "Because of something that happened a long time ago," he said. "Something you wouldn't dream could have anything to do with you or with me. Shall I tell you about it, Marette?" Her fingers pressed slightly upon his arm. "Yes." "Of course, it's a story of the police," he began. "And I won't mention this fellow's name. You may think of him as that red-headed O'Connor if you want to, but I don't say that it was he. He was a constable in the service and had been away north looking up some Indians who were brewing an intoxicating liquor from roots. That was 6 years ago. And he caught something. Le Mort Rouge, we sometimes call it, the Red Death, or smallpox. And he was alone when the fever knocked him down, 300 miles from anywhere. His Indian ran away at the first sign of it, and he had just time to get up his tent before he was flat on his back. I won't try to tell you of the days he went through. It was a living death. And he would have died, there is no doubt of it, if it hadn't been for a stranger who came along. He was a white man. Marette, it doesn't take a great deal of nerve to go up against a man with a gun, when you've got a gun of your own, and it doesn't take such a lot of nerve to go into battle when 1,000 others are going with you. But it does take nerve to face what that stranger faced. And the sick man was nothing to him. He went into that tent and nursed the other back to life. Then the sickness got him, and for 10 weeks those two were together, each fighting to save the other's life, and they won out. But the glory of it was with the stranger. He was going west. The constable was going south. They shook hands and parted. Marette's fingers tightened on Kent's arm, and Kent went on. And the constable never forgot, Gray Goose. He wanted the day to come when he might repay. And the time came. It was years later, and it worked out in a curious way. A man was murdered, and the constable, who had become a sergeant now, had talked with the dead man only a little while before he was killed. Returning for something he had forgotten, it was the sergeant who found him dead. Very shortly afterward, a man was arrested. There was blood on his clothing. The evidence was convincing, deadly. And this man— Kent paused, and in the darkness Marette's hand crept down his arm to his hand, and her fingers closed around it. "Was the man you lied to save," she whispered. "Yes. When the half-breed's bullet got me, I thought it was a good chance to repay Sandy McTrigger for what he did for me in that tent years before. But it wasn't heroic. It wasn't even brave. I thought I was going to die, and that I was risking nothing." And then there came a soft, joyous little laugh from where her head lay on the pillow. "And all the time you were lying so splendidly. Jeems, I knew," she cried. "I knew that you didn't kill Barkley, and I knew that you weren't going to die, and I knew what happened in that tent 10 years ago. And Jeems— She raised herself from the pillow. Her breath was coming a little excitedly. Both her hands, instead of one, were gripping his hand now. "I knew that you didn't kill John Barkley," she repeated. "And Sandy McTrigger didn't kill him." "But—" "He didn't," she interrupted him almost fiercely. "He was innocent as you were. Jeems, Jeems, I know who killed Barkley. Oh, I know. A choking sob came into her throat, and then she added, in a voice which she was straining to make calm, "Don't think I haven't faith in you, because I can't tell you more now, Jeems," she said. "You will understand quite soon. When we are safe from the police, I shall tell you. I shall keep nothing from you then. I shall tell you about Barkley and Kedsty, everything. But I can't now. It won't be long. When you tell me we are safe, I shall believe you. And then—" She withdrew her hands from his and dropped back on her pillow. "And then what?" he asked, leaning far over. "You may not like me, Jeems." "I love you," he whispered. "Nothing in the world can stop my loving you." "Even if I tell you soon that I killed Barkley?" "No. You would be lying." "Or if I told you that I killed Kedsty?" "No matter what you said, or what proof there might be back there, I would not believe you." She was silent. And then, "Jeems." "Yes, Niska, little goddess." "I'm going to tell you something now." He waited. "It is going to shock you, Jeems." He felt her arms reaching up. Her two hands touched his shoulders. "Are you listening?" "Yes, I am listening." "Because I'm not going to say it very loud." And then she whispered, "Jeems, I love you." End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 21 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. In the slowly breaking gloom of the cabin, with Marette's arms around his neck, her soft lips given him to kiss, Kent, for many minutes, was conscious of nothing but the thrill of his one great hope on earth come true. What he had prayed for was no longer a prayer, and what he had dreamed of was no longer a dream. Yet for a space the reality of it seemed unreal. What he said in those first moments of his exultation he would probably never remember. His own physical existence seemed a thing trivial and almost lost, a thing submerged and swallowed up by the warm beat and throb of that other life, 1,000 times more precious than his own, which he held in his arms. Yet with the mad thrill that possessed him, in the embrace of his arms, there was an infinite tenderness, a gentleness that drew from Marette's lips a low, glad whispering of his name. She drew his head down and kissed him, and Kent fell upon his knees at her side and crushed his face close down to her, while outside the patter of rain on the roof had ceased, and the fog-like darkness was breaking with gray dawn. In that dawn of the new day Kent came at last out of the cabin and looked upon a splendid world. In his breast was the glory of a thing new born, and the world, like himself, was changed. Storm had passed. The gray river lay under his eyes. Shoreward he made out the dark outlines of the deep spruce and cedar and balsam forests. About him there was a great stillness, broken only by the murmur of the river and the ripple of water under the scow. Wind had gone with the black rain clouds, and Kent, as he looked about him, saw the swift dissolution of the last shadows of night, and the breaking in the east of a new paradise. In the east, as the minutes passed, there came a soft and luminous gray, and after that, swiftly, with the miracle of far northern dawn, A vast, low-burning fire seemed to start far beyond the forests, tinting the sky with a delicate pink that crept higher and higher as Kent watched it. The river, all at once, came out of its last drifting haze of fog and night. The scow was about in the middle of the channel. 200 yards on either side were thick, green walls of forest, glistening fresh and cool with the wet of storm and breathing forth the perfume which Kent was drawing deep into his lungs. In the cabin he heard sound. Marette was up, and he was eager to have her come out and stand with him in this glory of their first day. He watched the smoke of the fire he had built, hardwood smoke that drifted up white and clean into the rain-washed air. The smell of it, like the smell of balsam and cedar, was to Kent the aroma of life. And then he began to clean out what was left of the water in the bottom of the scow, and as he worked he whistled. He wanted Marette to hear that whistle. He wanted her to know that day had brought with it no doubt for him. A great and glorious world was about them and ahead of them, and they were safe. As he worked, his mind became more than ever set upon the resolution to take no chances. He paused in his whistling for a moment to laugh softly and exultantly as he thought of the years of experience which were his surest safeguard now. He had become almost uncannily expert in all the finesse and trickery of his craft of hunting human game, and he knew what the man-hunters would do and what they would not do. He had them checkmated at the start. And besides, with Kedsty, O'Connor, and himself gone, the landing was short-handed just at present. There was an enormous satisfaction in that. But even with a score of men behind him, Kent knew that he would beat them. His hazard, if there was peril at all, lay in this first day. Only the police gasoline launch could possibly overtake them. And with the start they had, he was sure they would pass the death chute, conceal the scow, and take to the untracked forests north and west before the launch could menace them. After that he would keep always west and north, deeper and deeper into that wild and untraveled country which would be the last place in which the law would seek for them. He straightened himself and looked at the smoke again, drifting like gray-white lace between him and the blue of the sky, and in that moment the sun capped the tall green tops of the highest cedars, and day broke gloriously over the earth. For a quarter of an hour longer Kent mopped at the floor of the scow, and then, with a suddenness that drew him up as if a whiplash had snapped behind him, he caught another aroma in the clean, forest-scented air. It was bacon and coffee. He had believed that Marette was taking her time in putting on dry footwear and making some sort of morning toilet. Instead of that, she was getting breakfast. It was not an extraordinary thing to do. To fry bacon and make coffee was not, in any sense, a remarkable achievement, but at the present moment it was the crowning touch to Kent's paradise. She was getting his breakfast. And coffee. And bacon. To Kent, those two things had always stood for home. They were intimate and companionable. Where there were coffee and bacon, he had known children who laughed, women who sang, and men with happy, welcoming faces. They were home builders. "Whenever you smell coffee and bacon at a cabin," O'Connor had always said, "they'll ask you in to breakfast if you knock at the door." But Kent was not recalling his old trail mate's words. In the present moment all other thoughts were lost in the discovery that Marette was getting breakfast for him. He went to the door and listened. Then he opened it and looked in. Marette was on her knees before the open door of the stove, toasting bread on 2 forks. Her face was flushed pink. She had not taken time to brush her hair, but had woven it carelessly into a thick braid that fell down her back. She gave a little exclamation of mock disappointment when she saw Kent. "Why didn't you wait?" she remonstrated. "I wanted to surprise you." "You have," he said. "And I couldn't wait. I had to come in and help." He was inside the door and on his knees beside her. As he reached for the two forks, his lips pressed against her hair. The pink deepened in Marette's face, and the soft little note that was like laughter came into her throat. Her hand caressed his cheek as she rose to her feet, and Kent laughed back. And after that, as she arranged things on the shelf table, her hand, now and then, touched his shoulder or his hair, and 2 or 3 times he heard that wonderful little throat note that sent through him a wild pulse of happiness. And then, he sitting on the low chair and she on the stool, they drew close together before the board that answered as a table, and ate their breakfast. Marette poured his coffee and stirred sugar and condensed milk in it, and so happy was Kent that he did not tell her he used neither milk nor sugar in his coffee. The morning sun burst through the little window, and through the open door Kent pointed to the glory of it on the river and in the shimmering green of the forests slipping away behind. When they had finished, Marette went outside with him. For a space she stood silent and without movement, looking upon the marvelous world that encompassed them. It seemed to Kent that for a few moments she did not breathe. With her head thrown back and her white throat bare to the soft, balsam-laden air, she faced the forests. Her eyes became suddenly filled with the luminous glow of stars. Her face reflected the radiance of the rising sun, and Kent, looking at her, knew that he had never seen her so beautiful as in these wonderful moments. He held his own breath, for he also knew that Niska, his goddess, was looking upon her own world again after a long time away. Her world and his. Different from all the other worlds God had ever made. Different even from the world only a few miles behind them at the landing. For here was no sound or whisper of destroying human life. They were in the embrace of the great North, and it was drawing them closer, and with each minute nearer to the mighty, pulsing heart of it. The forests hung heavy and green and glistening with the wet of storm. Out of them came the tremulous breath of life and the glory of living. They hugged the shores like watchful hosts guarding the river from civilization, and suddenly the girl held out her arms, and Kent heard the low, thrilling cry that came to her lips. She had forgotten him. She had forgotten everything but the river, the forests, and the untrod worlds beyond them, and he was glad. For this world that she was welcoming, that her soul was crying out to, was his world, forever and ever. It held his dreams, his hopes, all the desires that he had in life. And when at last Marette turned toward him slowly, his arms were reaching out to her, and in his face she saw that same glory which filled her own. "I'm glad, glad," she cried softly. "Oh, Jeems, I'm glad." She came into his arms without hesitation. Her hands stroked his face, and then she stood with her head against his shoulder, looking ahead, breathing deeply now of the sweet, clear air filled with the elixir of the hovering forests. She did not speak or move, and Kent remained quiet. The scow drifted around a bend. Shoreward a great moose splashed up out of the water, and they could hear him afterward, crashing through the forest. Her body tensed, but she did not speak. After a little he heard her whisper, "It has been a long time, Jeems. I have been away 4 years." "And now we are going home, little Gray Goose. You will not be lonely?" "No. I was lonely down there. There were so many people and so many things that I was homesick for the woods and mountains. I believe I would have died soon. There were only two things I loved, Jeems." "What?" he asked. "Pretty dresses and shoes." His arms closed about her a little more tightly. I understand," he laughed softly. "That is why you came, that first time, with pretty high-heeled pumps." He bowed his head, and she turned her face to him. On her upturned mouth he kissed her. "More than any other man ever loved a woman, I love you, Niska, little goddess," he cried. The minutes and the hours of that day stood out ever afterward in Kent's life as unforgettable memories. There were times when they seemed illusory and unreal, as though he lived and breathed in an insubstantial world made up of gossamer things which must be the fabric of dream. These were moments when the black shadow of the tragedy from which they were fleeing pressed upon him, when the thought came to him that they were criminals racing with the law, that they were not on enchanted ground, but in deadly peril, that it was all a fool's paradise from which some terrible shock would shortly awaken them. But these periods of apprehension were, in themselves, mere shadows thrown for a moment upon his happiness. Again and again the subconscious force within him pounded home to his physical brain the great truth, that it was all extraordinarily real. It was Marette who made him doubt himself at times. He could not, quite yet, comprehend the fullness of that love which she had given him. More than ever, in the glory of this love that had come to them, she was like a child to him. It seemed to him in the first hours of the morning that she had forgotten yesterday, and the day before, and the days before that. She was going home. She whispered that to him so often that it became a little song in his brain. Yet she told him nothing of that home, and he waited, knowing that the fulfillment of her promise was not far away. And there was no embarrassment in the manner of her surrender when he held her in his arms, and she held her face up so that he could kiss her mouth and look into her glowing, lovely eyes. What he saw was the flush of a great happiness, the almost childish confession of it, along with the woman's joy of possession. And he thought of Kedsty, and of the law that was rousing itself into life back at Athabasca Landing. And then she ran her fingers through his own and told him to wait, and ran into the cabin and came out a moment later with her brush, and after that she seated herself at the fulcrum of the big sweep and began to brush out her hair in the sun. "I'm glad you love it, Jeems," she said. She unbound the thick braid and let the silken strands of it run caressingly between her fingers. She smoothed it out, brushed it until it was more beautiful than she had ever seen it in that glow of the sun. She held it up so that it rippled out the shimmering cascades about her, and then, suddenly, Kent saw the short tress from which had been clipped the rope of hair that he had taken from Kedsty's neck. And as his lips tightened, crushing fiercely the exclamation of his horror, there came a trembling happiness from Marette's lips, scarcely more than the whisper of a song, the low, thrilling melody of Le Chaudiere. Her arms reached up, and she drew his head down to her, so that for a time his visions were blinded in that sweet smother of her hair. The intimacy of that day was in itself like a dream. Hour after hour they drifted deeper into the great north. The sun shone. The forest-walled shores of the river grew mightier in their stillness and their grandeur, and the vast silence of unpeopled places brooded over the world. To Kent it was as if they were drifting through paradise. Occasionally he found it necessary to work the big sweep, for still water was gradually giving way to a swifter current. Beyond that there was no labor for him to perform. It seemed to him that with each of these wonderful hours danger was being left farther and still farther behind them. watching the shores, looking ahead, listening for sound that might come from behind, at times possessed of the exquisite thrills of children in their happiness, Kent and Marette found the gulf of strangeness passing swiftly away from between them. They did not speak of Kedsty or the tragedy, or again of the death of John Barkley. But Kent told of his days in the north, of his aloneness, of the wild, weird love in his soul for the deepest wildernesses, and from that he went away back into dim and distant yesterdays, alive with mellowed memories of boyhood days spent on a farm. To all these things Marette listened with glowing eyes, with low laughter, or with breath that rose or fell with his own emotions. She told of her own days down at school, and of their appalling loneliness, of childhood spent in the forests, of the desire to live there always. But she did not speak intimately of herself or her life in its more vital aspects. She said nothing of the home in the Valley of Silent Men, nothing of father or mother, sisters or brothers. There was no embarrassment in her omissions, and Kent did not question. He knew that those were among the things she would tell him when that promised hour came, the hour when he would tell her they were safe. There began to possess him now a growing eagerness for this hour, when they should leave the river and take to the forests. He explained to Marette why they could not float on indefinitely. The river was the one great artery through which ran the blood of all traffic to the far north. It was patrolled. Sooner or later they would be discovered. In the forests, with 1,000 untrod trails to choose, they would be safe. He had only one reason for keeping to the river until they passed through the Death Chute. It would carry them beyond a great swampy region to the westward, through which it would be impossible for them to make their way at this season of the year. Otherwise he would have gone ashore now. He loved the river, had faith in it, but he knew that not until the deep forest swallowed them, as a vast ocean swallows a ship, would they be beyond the peril that threatened them from the landing. 3 or 4 times between sunrise and noon they saw life ashore and on the stream. Once a scow tied to a tree, then an Indian camp, and twice trappers' shacks built in the edge of little clearings. With the beginning of afternoon, Kent felt growing within him something that was not altogether eagerness. It was, at times, a disturbing emotion, a foreshadowing of evil, a warning for him to be on his guard. He used the sweep more to help their progress in the current, and he began to measure time and distance with painstaking care. He recognized many landmarks. By 4 o'clock, or 5 at the latest, they would strike the head of the chute. 10 minutes of its thrilling passage, and he would work the scow into the concealment he had in mind ashore, and no longer would he fear the arm of the law that reached out from the landing. As he planned, he listened. From noon on he never ceased to listen for that distant put, put, put that would give them a mile's warning of the approach of the patrol launch. He did not keep his plans to himself. Marette sensed his growing uneasiness, and he made her a partner of his thoughts. "If we hear the patrol before we reach the chute, we'll still have time to run ashore," he assured her. "And they won't catch us. We'll be harder to find than 2 needles in a haystack, but it's best to be prepared." So he brought out his pack and Marette's smaller bundle, and laid his rifle and pistol holster across them. It was 3 o'clock when the character of the river began to change, and Kent smiled happily. They were entering upon swifter waters. There were places where the channel narrowed, and they sped through rapids. Only where unbroken straight waters stretched out ahead of them did Kent give his arms a rest at the sweep. And through most of the straight water he added to the speed of the scow. Marette helped him. In him the exquisite thrill of watching her slender, glorious body as it worked with his own never grew old. She laughed at him over the big oar between them. The wind and sun played riot in her hair. Her parted lips were rose red, her cheeks flushed, her eyes like sun-warmed rock violets. More than once, in the thrill of that afternoon flight, as he looked at the marvelous beauty of her, he asked himself if it could be anything but a dream. And more than once he laughed joyously, and paused in his swinging of the sweep, and proved that it was real and true. And Kent thanked God and worked harder. Once, a long time ago, Marette told him, she had been through the chute. It had horrified her then. She remembered it as a sort of death monster, roaring for its victims. As they drew nearer to it, Kent told her more about it. Only now and then was a life lost there now, he said. At the mouth of the chute there was a great knife-like rock, like a dragon's tooth, that cut the chute into two roaring channels. If a scow kept to the left-hand channel, it was safe. There would be a mighty roaring and thundering as it swept on its passage, but that roaring of the chute, he told her, was like the barking of a harmless dog. Only when a scow became unmanageable, or hit the dragon's tooth, or made the right-hand channel instead of the left, was there tragedy. There was that delightful little note of laughter in Marette's throat when Kent told her that. "You mean, Jeems, that if one of the three possible things doesn't happen, we'll get through safely?" "None of them is possible with us," he corrected himself quickly. "We've a tight little scow, we're not going to hit the rock, and we'll make the left-hand channel so smoothly you won't know when it happens." He smiled at her with splendid confidence. "I've been through it 100 times," he said. He listened. Then, suddenly, he drew out his watch. It was 4:15. Marette's ears caught what he heard. In the air was a low, trembling murmur. It was growing slowly, but steadily. He nodded when she looked at him, the question in her eyes. "The rapids at the head of the chute!" he cried, his voice vibrant with joy. "We've beat them out! We're safe!" They swung around a bend, and the white spume of the rapids lay half a mile ahead of them. The current began to race with them now. Kent put his whole weight on the sweep to keep the scow in mid-channel. "We're safe," he repeated. "Do you understand, Marette? We're safe!" He was speaking the words for which she had waited, was telling her that at last the hour had come when she could keep her promise to him. The words, as he gave them voice, thrilled him. He felt like shouting them. And then all at once he saw the change that had come into her face. Her wide, startled eyes were not looking at him, but beyond. She was looking back in the direction from which they had come, and even as she stared, her face grew white. "Listen!" She was tense, rigid. He turned his head. And in that moment it came to him above the growing murmur of the river, the put, put, put of the police patrol boat from Athabasca Landing. A deep breath came from between his lips. When Marette took her eyes from the river and looked at him, his face was like carven rock. He was staring dead ahead. "We can't make the chute," he said, his voice sounding hard and unreal to her. "If we do, they'll be up with us before we can land at the other end. We must let this current drive us ashore, now." As he made his decision, he put the strength of his body into action. He knew there was not the 100th part of a second to lose. The outreaching suction of the rapids was already gripping the scow, and with mighty strokes he fought to work the head of his craft toward the westward shore. With swift understanding, Marette saw the priceless value of a few seconds of time. If they were caught in the stronger swirl of the rapids before the shore was reached, they would be forced to run the chute, and in that event the launch would be upon them before they could make a landing farther on. She sprang to Kent's side and added her own strength in the working of the sweep. Foot by foot and yard by yard the scow made precious westing, and Kent's face lighted up with triumph as he nodded ahead to a timbered point that thrust itself out like a stubby thumb into the river. Beyond that point the rapids were frothing white, and they could see the first black walls of rock that marked the beginning of the chute. "We'll make it," he smiled confidently. "We'll hit that timbered point close inshore. I don't see where the launch can make a landing anywhere within a mile of the chute. And once ashore, we'll make trail about 5 times as fast they can follow it." Marette's face was no longer pale, but flushed with excitement. He caught the white gleam of teeth between her parted lips. Her eyes shone gloriously, and he laughed. "You beautiful little fighter!" he cried exultantly. You. His words were cut short by a snap that was like the report of a pistol close to his ears. He pitched forward and crashed to the bottom of the scow, Marette's slim body clutched in his arms as he fell. In a flash they were up, and mutely they stared where the sweep had been. The blade of it was gone. Kent was conscious of hearing a little cry from the girl at his side, and then her fingers were gripping tightly again about his thumb. No longer possessed of the power of guidance, the scow swung sideways. It swept past the wooded point. The white maelstrom of the lower rapids seized upon it, and Kent, looking ahead to the black maw of the death trap that was waiting for them, drew Marette close in his arms and held her tight. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 22 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. For a brief space after the breaking of the scow sweep, Kent did not move. He felt Marette's arms closing tighter and tighter around his neck. He caught a flash of her upturned face, the flush of a few moments before replaced by a deathly pallor, and he knew that without explanation on his part she understood the almost hopeless situation they were in. He was glad of that. It gave him a sense of relief to know that she would not go into a panic, no matter what happened. He bowed his face to hers so that he felt the velvety smoothness of her cheek. She turned her mouth to him, and they kissed. His embrace was crushing for a moment, fierce with his love for her, desperate with his determination to keep her from harm. His brain was working swiftly. There was possibly 1 chance in 10 that the scow, rudderless and without human guidance, would sweep safely between the black walls and jagged teeth of the chute. Even if the scow made this passage, they would be in the power of the police, unless some splendid whimsicality of fate sent it ashore before the launch came through. On the other hand, if it was carried far enough through the lower rapids, they might swim. And there was the rifle laying across the pack. That, after all, was his greatest hope, if the scow made the passage of the chute. The bulwarks of the scow would give them greater protection than the thinner walls of the launch would give to their pursuers. In his heart there raged suddenly a hatred for that law of which he had been a part. It was running them to destruction, and he would fight. There would not be more than 3 men in the launch, and he would kill them if killing became a necessity. They were speeding like an unbridled racehorse through the boiling rapids now. The clumsy craft under their feet twisted and turned. The dripping tops of great rocks shot past a little out of their channel. and Marette, with one arm still about his neck, was facing the peril ahead with him. They could see the dragon's tooth, black and grim, waiting squarely in their path. In another 120 seconds they would be upon it, or past it. There was no time for Kent to explain. He sprang to his pack, whipped a knife from his pocket, and cut the stout babiche rope that reinforced its straps. In another instant he was back at Marette's side, fastening the babiche about her waist. The other end he gave to her, and she tied it about his wrist. She smiled as she finished the knot. It was a strange, tense little smile, but it told him that she was not afraid, that she had great faith in him, and knew what the babiche meant. "I can swim, James," she cried, "if we strike the rock." She did not finish because of the sudden cry that came to his lips. He had almost forgotten the most vital of all things. There was not time to unlace his boots. With his knife he cut the laces in a single downward thrust. Swiftly he freed his own feet and Marette's. Even in this hour of their peril it thrilled him to see how quickly Marette responded to the thoughts that moved him. She tore at her outer garments and slipped them off as he wriggled out of his heavy shirt. A slim, white underskirted little thing, her glorious hair flying in the wind that came through the chute, her throat and arms bare, her eyes shining at Kent, she came again close within his arms, and her lips framed softly his name. And a moment later she turned her face up, and cried quickly, "Kiss me, Jeems! Kiss me!" Her warm lips clung to his, and her bare arms encircled his neck with the choking grip of a child's. He looked ahead, and braced himself on his feet, and after that he buried one of his hands in the soft mass of her hair, and pressed her face against his naked breast. 10 seconds later the crash came. Squarely amidships the scow struck the dragon's tooth. Kent was prepared for the shock, but his attempt to hold his feet, with Marette in his arms, was futile. The bulwark saved them from crashing against the slippery face of the rock itself. Amid the roar of water that filled his ears, he was conscious of the rending of timbers. The scow bulged up with the mighty force beneath, and for a second or two it seemed as though that force was going to overturn and submerge it. Then, slowly, it began to slip off the nose of the rock. Holding to the rail with one hand, and clinging to Marette with his other arm, Kent was gripped in the horror of what was happening. The scow was slipping into the right-hand channel. In that channel there was no hope, only death. Marette was squarely facing the thing ahead. In this hour, when each second held a lifetime of suspense, Kent saw that she understood. Yet she did not cry out. Her face was dead white. Her hair and arms and shoulders were dripping with the splash of water. But she was not terrified as he had seen terror. When she turned her eyes to him, he was amazed by the quiet, calm look that was in them. Her lips trembled. His soul expressed itself in a wordless cry that was drowned in another crash of timber, as a jutting snag of the tooth crumpled up the little cabin as if it had been pasteboard. He felt overwhelming him the surge of a thing mightier than the menace of the chute. He could not lose. It was inconceivable, impossible. With her to fight for, this slim, wonderful creature who smiled at him even as she saw death. And then, as his arm closed still more tightly about her, the monsters of power and death gave him their answer. The scow swung free of the dragon's tooth, half filled with water. Its cracked and broken carcass was caught in the rock jaws of the eastern channel. It ceased to be a floating thing. It was inundation, dissolution, utter obliteration almost without shock. And Kent found himself in the thundering rush of waters, holding to Marette. For a space they were under. Black water and white froth fumed and exploded over them. It seemed an age before fresh air filled Kent's nostrils. He thrust Marette upward and cried out to her. He heard her answer. "I'm all right, Jeems." His swimming prowess was of little avail now. He was like a chip. All his effort was to make of himself a barrier between Marette's soft body and the rocks. It was not the water itself that he feared, but the rocks. There were scores and hundreds of them, like the teeth of a mighty grinding machine. And the jaw was 1/4 mile in length. He felt the first shock, the second, the third. He was not thinking of time or distance, but was fighting solely to keep himself between Marette and death. The first time he failed, a blind sort of rage burned in his brain. He saw her white body strained over a slippery, deluge-worn rock. Her head was flung back, and he saw the long masses of her hair streaming out in the white froth, and he thought for an instant that her fragile body had been broken. He fought still more fiercely after that. And she knew for what he was fighting. Only in an unreal sort of way was he conscious of shock and hurt. It gave him no physical pain. Yet he sensed the growing dizziness in his head, an increasing lack of strength in his arms and body. They were halfway through the chute when he shot against a rock with terrific force. The contact tore Marette from him. He plunged for her, missed his grip, and then saw her opposite him, clinging to the same rock. The babiche rope had saved her. Fastened about her waist and tied to his wrist, it still held them together, with the 5 feet of rock between them. Panting, their life half beaten out of them, their eyes met over that rock. Now that he was out of the water, the blood began streaming from Kent's arms and shoulders and face, but he smiled at her, as a few moments before she had smiled at him. Her eyes were filled with the pain of his hurts. He nodded back in the direction from which they had come. "We're out of the worst of it," he tried to shout. "As soon as we've got our wind, I will climb over the rock to you. It won't take us longer than a couple of minutes, perhaps less, to make the quiet water at the end of the channel." She heard him and nodded her reply. He wanted to give her confidence, and he had no intention of resting, for her position filled him with a terror which he fought to hide. The babiche rope, not half as large around as his little finger, had swung her to the downstream side of the rock. It was the slender thread of buckskin and his own weight that were holding her. If the buckskin should break... He thanked God that it was the tough babiche that had been around his pack. An inch at a time he began to draw himself up on the rock. The undertow behind the rock had flung a mass of Marette's long hair toward him, so that it was a foot or two nearer to him than her clinging hands. He worked himself toward that, for he saw that he could reach it more quickly than he could reach her. At the same time he had to keep his end of the babiche taut. It was, from the beginning, an almost superhuman task. The rock was slippery as oil. Twice his eyes shot downstream, with the thought that it might be better to cast himself bodily into the water, and after that draw Marette to him by means of the babiche. What he saw convinced him that such action would be fatal. He must have Marette in his arms. If he lost her, even for a few seconds, the life would be beaten from her body in that rock-strewn maelstrom below. And then, suddenly, the babiche cord about his wrist grew loose. The reaction almost threw him back. With the loosening of it, a cry came from Marette. It all happened in an instant, in almost less time than his brain could seize upon the significance of it, the slipping of her hands from the rock, the shooting of her white body away from him in the still whiter spume of the rapids. The rock had cut the babiche, and she was gone. With a cry that was like the cry of a madman, he plunged after her. The water engulfed him. He twisted himself up, freeing himself from the undertow. 20 feet ahead of him, 30, he caught a glimpse of a white arm and then of Marette's face, before she disappeared in a wall of froth. Into that froth he shot after her. He came out of it blinded, groping wildly for her, crying out her name. His fingers caught the end of the babiche that was fastened about his own wrist, and he clutched it savagely, believing for a moment that he had found her. Thicker and more deadly the rocks of the lower passage rose in his way. They seemed like living things, like devils filled with the desire to torture and destroy. They struck and beat at him. Their laughter was the roar of a Niagara. He no longer cried out. His brain grew heavy, and clubs were beating and breaking him into a formless thing. The rock drifts of spume, lather white, like the frosting of a monster cake, turned gray, and then black. He did not know when he ceased fighting. The day went out. Night came. The world was oblivion. And for a space he ceased to live. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 23 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. An hour later, the fighting forces in his body dragged Kent back into existence. He opened his eyes. The shock of what had happened did not at once fall upon him. His first sensation was of awakening from a sleep that had been filled with pain and horror. Then he saw a black rock wall opposite him. He heard the sullen roar of the stream. His eyes fell upon a vivid patch of light reflected from the setting sun. He dragged himself up until he was on his knees, and all at once a thing that was like an iron hoop, choking his senses, seemed to break in his head, and he staggered to his feet, crying out Marette's name. Understanding inundated him with its horror, deadening his tongue after that first cry, filling his throat with a moaning, sobbing agony. Marette was gone. She was lost. She was dead. Swiftly, as reason came, his eyes took in his environment. For a quarter of a mile above him he could see the white spume between the chasm walls, darkening with the approach of night. He could hear more clearly the roar of the death floods. But close to him was smooth water, and he stood now on a shelving tongue of rock and shale upon which the current had flung him. In front of him was a rock wall. Behind him was another. There was no footing except where he stood. And Marette was not with him. Only the truth could batter at his brain as he stood there. But his physical self refused to accept that truth. If he had lived, she must live. She was there, somewhere, along the shore, among the rocks. The moaning in his throat gave way to the voicing of her name. He shouted, and listened. He swayed back along the tongue of rock to the boulder-strewn edge of the chasm wall. 100 yards farther on was the opening of the chute. He came out of this, his clothes torn from him, his body bleeding, unrecognizable, half a madman, shouting her name more and more loudly. The glow of the setting sun struck him at last. He was out from between the chasm walls, and it lighted up the green world for him. Ahead of him the river widened and swept on in tranquil quiet. And now it was no longer fear that possessed him. It was the horrible, overwhelming certainty of the thing. The years fell from him, and he sobbed, sobbed like a boy stricken by some great childish grief as he searched along the edge of the shore. Over and over again he cried and whispered Marette's name. But he did not shout it again, for he knew that she was dead. She was gone from him forever. Yet he did not cease to search. The last of the sun went out. Twilight came, and then darkness. Even in that darkness he continued to search for a mile below the chute, calling her name more loudly now, and listening always for the answer which he knew would never come. The moon came out after a time, and hour after hour he kept up his hopeless quest. He did not know how badly the rocks had battered and hurt him, and he scarcely knew when it was that exhaustion dropped him like a dead man in his tracks. When dawn came, it found him wandering away from the river, and toward noon of that day he was found by André Boileau, the old white-haired half-breed who trapped on Burntwood Creek. André was shocked at the sight of his wounds, and half dragged and half carried him to his shack hidden away in the forest. For 6 days thereafter Kent remained at old André's place, simply because he had neither the strength nor the reason to move. André wondered that there were no broken bones in him, but his head was terribly hurt, and it was that hurt that for 3 days and 3 nights made Kent hover with nerve-racking indecision between life and death. The 4th day reason came back to him, and Boileau fed him venison broth. The 5th day he stood up. The 6th he thanked André and said that he was ready to go. André outfitted him with old clothes, gave him a supply of food and God's blessing. And Kent returned to the chute, giving André to understand that his destination was Athabasca Landing. Kent knew that it was not wise for him to return to the river. He knew that it would have been better for him both in mind and body had he gone in the opposite direction. But he no longer had in him the desire to fight, even for himself. He followed the lines of least resistance, and these led him back to the scene of the tragedy. His grief, when he returned, was no longer the heartbreaking agony of that first night. It was a deep-seated, consuming fire that had already burned him out, heart and soul. Even caution was dead in him. He feared nothing, avoided nothing. Had the police boat been at the chute, he would have revealed himself without any thought of self-preservation. A ray of hope would have been precious medicine to him. But there was no hope. Marette was dead. Her tender body was destroyed. And he was alone, unfathomably and hopelessly alone. And now, after he had reached the river again, something held him there. From the head of the chute to a bend in the river 2 miles below, his feet wore a beaten trail. 3 or 4 times a day he would make the trip, and along the path he set a few snares in which he caught rabbits for food. Each night he made his bed in a crevice among the rocks at the foot of the chute. At the end of a week the old Jim Kent was dead. Even O'Connor would not have recognized him with his shaggy growth of beard, his hollow eyes, and the sunken cheeks which the beard failed to hide. And the fighting spirit in him also was dead. Once or twice there leaped up in him a sudden passion demanding vengeance upon the accursed law that was accountable for the death of Marette, but even this flame snuffed itself out quickly. And then, on the 8th day, he saw the edge of a thing that was almost hidden under an overhanging bank. He fished it out. It was Marette's little pack, and for many minutes before he opened it, Kent crushed the sodden treasure to his breast, staring with half-mad eyes down where he had found it, as if Marette must be there, too. Then he ran with it to an open space where the sun fell warmly on a great, flat rock that was level with the ground, and with sobbing breath he opened it. It was filled with the things she had picked up quickly in her room the night of their flight from Kedsty's bungalow, and as he drew them out one by one and placed them in the sun on the rock, a new and sudden rush of life swept through his veins, and he sprang to his feet and faced the river again, as if at last a hope had come to him. Then he looked down again upon what she had treasured, and reaching out his arms to them, he whispered, "Marette, my little goddess!" Even in his grief, the overwhelming mastery of his love for the one who was dead brought a smile to his haggard and bearded face. For Marette, in filling her little pack on that night of hurried flight, had chosen strange things. On the sunlit rock where he had placed them were a pair of the little pumps which he had fallen on his knees to worship in her room, and with these she had crowded into the pack one of the billowing, sweet-smelling dresses which had made his heart stand still for a moment when he first looked into their hiding-place. It was no longer soft and cobwebby as it had been then, like down fluttering against his cheeks, but sodden and discolored as it lay on the rock with little rivulets of water running from it. With the shoes and the dress were the intimate necessities which Marette had taken with her. But it was one of the pumps that Kent picked up and crushed close to his ragged breast, one of the two she had worn that first wonderful day she had come to see him at Cardigan's place. This hour was the beginning of another change in Kent. It seemed to him that a message had come to him from Marette herself, that the spirit of her had returned to him and was with him now, stirring strange things in his soul and warming his blood with a new heat. She was gone forever, and yet she had come back to him, and the truth grew upon him that this spirit of her would never leave him again as long as he lived. He felt her nearness. Unconsciously he reached out his arms, and a strange happiness entered into him to battle with grief and loneliness. His eyes shone with a new glow as they looked at her little belongings on that sunlit rock. It was as if they were flesh and blood of her, a part of her heart and soul. They were the voice of her faith in him, her promise that she would be with him always. For the first time in many days, Kent felt a new force within him, and he knew that she was not quite gone, that he had something of her left to fight for. That night he made his bed for a last time in the crevice between the rocks, and his treasure was gathered within the protecting circle of his arms as he slept. The next day he struck out north and east. On the 5th day after he left the country of Andre Boileau, he traded his watch to a half-breed for a cheap gun, ammunition, a blanket, flour, and a cooking outfit. After that he had no hesitation in burying himself still deeper into the forests. A month later, no one would have recognized Kent as the one-time crack man of N Division. Bearded, ragged, long-haired, he wandered with no other purpose than to be alone and to get still farther away from the river. Occasionally he talked with an Indian or a half-breed. Each night, though the weather was very warm, he made himself a small camp-fire, for it was always in these hours, with the firelight about him, that he felt Marette was very near. It was then that he took out one by one the precious things that were in Marette's little pack. He worshipped these things. The dress and each of the little shoes he had wrapped in the velvety inner bark of the birch tree. He protected them from wet and storm. Had emergency called for it, he would have fought for them. They became, after a time, more precious than his own life, and in a vague sort of way, at first, he began to thank God that the river had not robbed him of everything. Kent's inclination was not to fight himself into forgetfulness. He wanted to remember every act, every word, every treasured caress that chained him for all time to the love he had lost. Marette became more a part of him every day. Dead in the flesh, she was always at his side, nestling close in the shelter of his arms at night, walking with her hand in his during the day. And in this belief his grief was softened by the sweet and merciful comfort of a possession of which neither man nor fate could rob him, a beloved presence always with him. It was this presence that rebuilt Kent. It urged him to throw up his head again, to square his shoulders, to look life once more straight in the face. It was both inspiration and courage to him, and grew nearer and dearer to him as time passed. Early autumn found him in the Fond du Lac country, 200 miles east of Fort Chipewyan. That winter he joined a Frenchman, and until February they trapped along the edges of the lower fingers of the barrens. He came to think a great deal of Picard, his comrade, but he revealed nothing of his secret to him, or of the new desire that was growing in him. And as the winter lengthened, this desire became a deep and abiding yearning. It was with him night and day. He dreamed of it when he slept, and it was never out of his thoughts when awake. He wanted to go home. And when he thought of home, it was not of the Landing, and not of the country south. For him, home meant only one place in the world now, the place where Marette had lived. Somewhere, hidden in the mountains far north and west, was that mysterious Valley of Silent Men where they had been going when her body died. And the spirit of her wanted him to go to it now. It was like a voice pleading with him, urging him to go, to live there always where she had lived. He began to plan, and in this planning he found new joy and new life. He would find her home, her people, the valley that was to have been their paradise. So, late in February, with his share of the winter catch in his pack, he said good-bye to Picard and faced the river again. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 24 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. Kent had not forgotten that he was an outlaw, but he was not afraid. Now that he had something new and thrilling to fight for, he fell back again upon what he called the finesse of the game. He approached Chipewyan cautiously, although he was sure that even his old friends at the Landing would fail to recognize him now. His beard was 4 or 5 inches long, and his hair was shaggy and uncut. Picard had made him a coat that winter of young caribou skin, and it was fringed like an Indian's. Kent chose his time and entered Chipewyan just before dusk. Oil lamps were burning in the Hudson's Bay Company's store when he went in with his furs. The place was empty, except for the factor's clerk, and for an hour he bartered. He bought a new outfit, a Winchester rifle, and all the supplies he could carry. He did not forget a razor and a pair of shears, and when he was done he still had the value of 2 silver fox skins in cash. He left Chipewyan that same night, and by the light of a winter moon made his camp 6 miles northward, toward Smith Landing. He was on the Slave River now, and for weeks traveled slowly but steadily northward on snowshoes. He avoided Fort Smith and Smith Landing, and struck westward before he came to Fort Resolution. It was in April that he struck Hay River Post, where the Hay River empties into Great Slave Lake. Until the ice broke up, Kent worked at Hay River. When it was safe, he started down the Mackenzie in a canoe. It was late in June when he turned up the Liard to the South Nahanni. "You go straight through between the sources of the North and the South Nahanni," Marette had told him. "It is there you find the Sulphur Country, and beyond the Sulphur Country is the Valley of Silent Men." At last he came to the edge of this country. He camped with the stink of it in his nostrils. The moon rose, and he saw that desolate world as through the fumes of a yellow smoke. With dawn he went on. He passed through broad, low morasses out of which rose sulphurous fogs. Mile after mile he buried himself deeper in it, and it became more and more a dead country, a lost hell. There were berry bushes on which there grew no berries. There were forests and swamps, but without a living creature to inhabit them. It was a country of water in which there were no fish, of air in which there were no birds, of plants without flowers, a reeking, stinking country still with the stillness of death. He began to turn yellow. His clothing, his canoe, his hands, face, everything turned yellow. He could not get the filthy taste of sulphur out of his mouth. Yet he kept on, straight west by the compass Gowan had given him at Hay River. Even this compass became yellow in his pocket. It was impossible for him to eat. Only twice that day did he drink from his flask of water. And Marette had made this journey. He kept telling himself that. It was the secret way in and out of their hidden world, a region accursed by devils, a forbidden country to both Indian and white man. It was hard for him to believe that she had come this way, that she had drunk in the air that was filling his own lungs, nauseating him a dozen times to the point of sickness. He worked desperately. He felt neither fatigue nor the heat of the warm water about him. Night came, and the moon rose, lighting up with a sickly glow the diseased world that had swallowed him. He lay in the bottom of his canoe, covering his face with his caribou coat, and tried to sleep. But sleep would not come. Before dawn he struck on, watching his compass by the light of matches. All that day he made no effort to swallow food. But with the coming of the second night he found the air easier to breathe. He fought his way on by the light of the moon, which was clearer now. And at last, in a resting spell, he heard far ahead of him the howl of a wolf. In his joy he cried out. A western breeze brought him air that he drank in as a desert-stricken man drinks water. He did not look at his compass again, but worked steadily in the face of that fresh air. An hour later he found that he was paddling again a slow current, and when he tasted the water it was only slightly tainted with sulphur. By midnight the water was cool and clean. He landed on a shore of sand and pebbles, stripped to the skin, and gave himself such a scouring as he had never before experienced. He had worn his old trapping shirt and trousers, and after his bath he changed to the outfit which he had kept clean in his pack. Then he built a fire and ate his first meal in 2 days. The next morning he climbed a tall spruce and surveyed the country about him. Westward there was a broad, low country shut in 15 or 20 miles away by the foothills. Beyond these foothills rose the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. He shaved himself, cut his hair, and went on. That night he camped only when he could drive his canoe no farther. The waterway had narrowed to a creek, and he was among the first green shoulders of the hills when he stopped. With another dawn he concealed his canoe in a sheltered place, and went on with his pack. For a week he picked his way slowly westward. It was a splendid country into which he had come, and yet he found no sign of human life. The foothills changed to mountains, and he believed he was in the Campbell Range. Also, he knew that he had followed the logical trail from the Sulphur Country. Yet it was the 8th day before he came upon a sign which told him that another living being had at some time passed that way. What he found were the charred remnants of an old campfire. It had been a white man's fire. He knew that by the size of it. It had been an all-night fire of green logs cut with an axe. On the 10th day he came to the westward slope of the first range, and looked down upon one of the most wonderful valleys his eyes had ever beheld. It was more than a valley. It was a broad plain. 50 miles across it rose the towering majesty of the mightiest of all the Yukon mountains. And now, though he saw a paradise about him, his heart began to sink within him. It seemed to him inconceivable that in a country so vast he could find the spot for which he was seeking. His one hope lay in finding white men or Indians, someone who might guide him. He traveled slowly over the 50-mile plain, rich with a verdure of green, covered with flowers, a game paradise. Few hunters had come so far out of the Yukon mountains, he told himself, and none had come from out of the Sulphur Country. It was a new and undiscovered world. On his map it was a blank space, and there were no signs of people. Ahead of him the Yukon mountains rose in an impenetrable wall, peak after peak, crested with snow, towering like mighty watchdogs above the clouds. He knew what lay beyond them, the great rivers of the western slope, Dawson City, the gold country and its civilization. But those things were on the other side of the mountains. On his side there was only the vast and undisputed silence of a paradise as yet unclaimed by man. As he went on into this valley there grew upon him a strange and comforting peace. Yet with it there was a steadily increasing belief that he would not find that for which he had come in search. He did not attempt to analyze this belief. It became a part of him, just as his mental tranquility had grown upon him. His one hope of success was that nearer the mountains he might find white men or Indians. He no longer used his compass, but guided himself by a cluster of 3 gigantic peaks. One of these was taller than the other 2. As he journeyed, his eyes were always returning to it. It fascinated him, impinged itself upon him as the watcher of 1,000,000 years, guarding the valley. He began to think of it as the watcher. Each hour of his progress seemed to bring it a little more intimately to his vision. From his first night's camp in the valley he saw the moon sink behind it. Within him a voice that never died kept whispering to him that this mountain, greater than all the others, had been Marette's guardian. 10,000 times she must have looked at it, as he had looked at it that day, if her home was anywhere this side of the Campbell Range. 100 miles away she could have seen the watcher on a clear day. On the second day the mountain continued to grow upon Kent. By mid-afternoon it began to take on a new character. The peak of it was in the form of a mighty castle that changed as he advanced. And the 2 lesser peaks were forming into definite contours. Before the haze of twilight dimmed his vision, he knew that what he had seen was not a whimsical invention of his imagination. The watcher had grown into the shape of a mighty human head facing south. A restless excitement possessed him, and he traveled on long after dusk. At dawn he was on the trail again. Westward the sky cleared, and suddenly he stopped, and a cry came from him. The watcher's head was there, as if chiseled by the hands of giants. The two smaller peaks had unveiled their mystery. Startling and weird, their crests had taken on the form of human heads. One of them was looking north. The other faced the valley. And Kent, his heart pounding, cried to himself, "The Silent Men!" He did not hear himself, but the thought itself was a tumultuous thing within him. It came upon him like an inundation, a sudden and thrilling inspiration backed by the forces of a visual truth. The Valley of Silent Men. He repeated the words, staring at the three colossal heads in the sky. Somewhere near them, under them, one side or the other, was Marette's hidden valley. He went on. A strange joy consumed him. In it, at times, his grief was obliterated, and it seemed to him in these moments that Marette must surely be at the valley to greet him when he came to it. But always the tragedy of the Death Chute came back to him, and with it the thought that the three giant heads were watching, and would always watch, for a beloved lost one who would never return. As the sun went down that day, the face bowed to the valley seemed alive with the fire of a living question sent directly to Kent. "Where is she?" it asked. "Where is she? Where is she?" That night Kent did not sleep. The next day there lay ahead of him a low and broken range, the first of the deeper mountains. He climbed this steadily, and at noon had reached the crest. And he knew that at last he was looking down into the Valley of Silent Men. It was not a wide valley like the other. On the far side of it, 3 or 4 miles away, rose the huge mountain whose face was looking down upon the green meadows at its foot. Southward, Kent could see for a long distance, and in the vivid sunlight he saw the shimmer of creeks and little lakes, and the rich glow of thick patches of cedar and spruce and balsam, scattered like great rugs of velvety luster amid the flowering green of the valley. Northward, 3 or 4 miles away, the range which he had climbed made a sharp twist to the east, and that part of the valley, following the swing of the range, was lost to him. He turned in this direction after he had rested. It was 4 o'clock when he came to the elbow in the valley and could look down into the hidden part of it. What he saw at first was a giant cup hollowed out of the surrounding mountains, a cup 2 miles from brim to brim, the end of the valley itself. It took him a few moments to focus his vision so that it would pick up the smaller and more intimate things 1/2 a mile under him, and yet, before he had done this, a sound came up to him that set aquiver every nerve in his body. It was the far down, hollow-sounding barking of a dog. The warm, golden haze that precedes sunset by the mountains was gathering between him and the valley, but through this he made out after a time evidences of human habitation almost straight under him. There was a small lake, out of which ran a shimmering creek, and close to this lake, yet equally near to the base of the mountain on which he was standing, were a number of buildings and a stockade which looked like a toy. He could see no animals, no movement of any kind. Without seeking for a downward trail, he began to descend. Again he did not question himself. An overwhelming certainty possessed him. Of all places in the world, this must be the Valley of Silent Men. And below him, flooded and half hidden in the elusive sun mist, was Marette's old home. It seemed to him now that it belonged to him, that he was a part of it, that in going to it he was achieving his last great resting place, his final refuge, his own home. and the thought became strangely a part of him that a welcome must be waiting for him there. He hurried until his breath came pantingly between his lips, and he was forced to rest. And at last he found himself where his progress was made a foot at a time, and again he was forced to climb back and detour around treacherous slides and precipitous breaks which left sheer falls at his feet. The mist thickened in the valley. The sun sank behind the western peaks, and swiftly after that the gloom of twilight deepened. It was 7 o'clock when he came to the edge of the plain, at least a mile below the elbow which shut out the cup in the valley. He was exhausted. His hands were bruised and bleeding. Darkness shut him in when he went on. When he rounded the elbow of the mountain, he did not try to keep back the joyous cry that came to his lips. Ahead of him there were lights. A few of them were scattered, but nearest to him he saw a cluster of them, like the glow that comes from a number of illuminated windows. He quickened his pace as he drew nearer to them, and at last he wanted to run. And then something stopped him, and it seemed to him that his heart had risen into his throat and was choking him until he could not breathe. It was a man's voice he heard, calling through the twilight gloom a name. "Marette! Marette! Marette!" Kent tried to cry out, but his breath came only in a gasp. He felt himself trembling. He reached out his arms, and a strange madness rushed like fire into his brain. Again the voice called, "Marette! Marette! Marette!" The cup in the valley echoed the name. It rolled softly up the mountainside. The air trembled with it, whispered it, passed it on, and suddenly the madness in Kent found voice, and he shouted, "Marette! Marette!" He ran on. His knees felt weak. He shouted the name again, and the other voice was silent. Things loomed up out of the mist ahead of him, between him and the glowing windows. Two people, were advancing to meet him, doubtfully, wonderingly. Kent was staggering, but he cried the name again, and this time it was a woman's cry that answered, and one of the two came toward him swift as a flash of light. 3 paces apart they stood, and in that gloom of the after twilight their burning eyes looked at each other, while for a space their bodies remained stricken in the face of this miracle of a great and merciful God. The dead had risen. By a mighty effort Kent reached out his arms, and Marette swayed to him. When the other man came up, he found them crumpled to their knees on the earth, clasped like children in each other's arms. And as Kent raised his face, he saw that it was Sandy McTrigger who was looking down at him, the man whose life he had saved at Athabasca Landing. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 25 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 25. How long it was before his brain cleared, Kent never could have told. It might have been a minute or an hour. Every vital force that was in him had concentrated into a single consciousness, that the dead had come to life, that it was Marette Radisson, the flesh and blood and living warmth of her, he held in his arms. Like the flash of a picture on a screen, he had seen McTrigger's face close to him, and then his own head was crushed down again, and if the valley had been filled with the roar of cannon, he would have heard only one sound, A sobbing voice crying over and over again, "Jeems! Jeems! Jeems!" It was McTrigger in the beginning of the starlight, who alone looked with clear vision upon the wonder of the thing that was happening. After a little, Kent realized that McTrigger was talking, that a hand was on his shoulder, that the voice was both joyous and insistent. He rose to his feet, still holding Marette, her arms clinging to him. Her breath was sobbing and broken. And it was impossible for Kent to speak. He seemed to stumble over the distance between them and the light, with McTrigger on the other side of Marette. It was McTrigger who opened a door, and they came into a glow of lamplight. It was a great, strange-looking room they entered. And over the threshold, Marette's hands dropped from Kent, and Kent stepped back, so that in the light they faced each other. And in that moment came the marvelous readjustment from shock and disbelief to a glorious certainty. Again, Kent's brain was as clear as the day he faced death at the head of the chute. And swift as a hot barb, a fear leaped into him as his eyes met the eyes of the girl. She was terribly changed. Her face was white with a whiteness that startled him. It was thin. Her eyes were great, slumbering pools of violet, almost black in the lamp-glow, and her hair, piled high on her head as he had seen it that first day at Cardigan's, added to the telltale pallor in her cheeks. A hand trembled at her throat, and its thinness frightened him. For a space, a flash of seconds, she looked at him as if possessed of the subconscious fear that he was not Jim Kent. And then slowly her arms opened, and she reached them out to him. She did not smile, she did not cry out, she did not speak his name now, but her arms went around his neck as he took her to him, and her face dropped on his breast. He looked at McTrigger. A woman was standing beside him, a dark-haired, dark-eyed woman, and she had laid a hand on McTrigger's arm. Kent, looking at them, understood. The woman came to him. "I had better take her now, monsieur," she said. "Malcolm will tell you. And a little later you may see her again." Her voice was low and soft. At the sound of it, Marette raised her head, and her two hands stole to Kent's cheeks in their old sweet way, and she whispered, "Kiss me, Jeems. My Jeems, kiss me." End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 26 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. A little later, clasping hands in the lamp-glow, Kent and Sandy McTrigger stood alone in the big room. In their hand-clasp was the warm thrill of strong men met in an immutable brotherhood. Each had faced death for the other. Yet this thought, subconsciously and forever a part of them, expressed itself only in the grip of their fingers and in the understanding that lay deep in their eyes. In Kent's face the great question was of Marette. McTrigger saw the fear of it, and slowly he smiled, a glad and yet an anxious smile, as he looked toward the door through which Marette and the older woman had gone. "Thank God you have come in time," he said, still holding Kent's hand. "She thought you were dead. And I know, Kent, that it was killing her. We had to watch her at night. Sometimes she would wander out into the valley. She said she was looking for you. It was that way tonight." Kent gulped hard. "I understand now," he said. "It was the living soul of her that was pulling me here. He took his pack with its precious contents from his shoulders, listening to McTrigger. They sat down. What McTrigger was saying seemed of trifling consequence beside the fact that Marette was somewhere beyond the other door, alive, and that he would see her again very soon. He did not see why McTrigger should tell him that the older woman was his wife. Even the fact that a splendid chance had thrown Marette upon a log wedged between two rocks in the chute, and that this log, breaking away, had carried her to the opposite side of the river, miles below, was trivial with the thought that only a door separated them now. But he listened. He heard McTrigger tell how Marette had searched for him those days when he was lost in fever at Andre Boileau's cabin, how she had given him up for dead, and how in those same days Lascelles' brigade had floated down, and she had come north with it. Later he would marvel over these things, but now he listened, and his eyes turned toward the door. It was then that McTrigger drove something home. It was like a shot piercing Kent's brain. McTrigger was speaking quietly of O'Connor. He said, "But you probably came by way of Fort Simpson, Kent, and O'Connor has told you all this. It was he who brought Marette back home through the sulphur country." O'Connor! Kent sprang to his feet. It took McTrigger but a moment to read the truth in his face. "Good God! Do you mean to tell me you don't know, Kent?" he whispered tensely, rising in front of the other. "Haven't you seen O'Connor? Haven't you come in touch with the police anywhere within the last year? Don't you know?" "I know nothing," breathed Kent. For a space McTrigger stared at him in amazement. "I have been in hiding," said Kent. "All this time I have been keeping away from the police." McTrigger drew a deep breath. Again his hands gripped Kent's, and his voice was incredulous, filled with a great wonder. "And you have come to her old home, believing that Marette killed Kedsty." "It is hard to believe. And yet—" Into his face came suddenly a look of grief, almost of pain, and Kent, following his eyes, saw that he was looking at a big stone fireplace in the end of the room. "It was O'Connor who worked the thing out last winter," he said, speaking with an effort. "I must tell you before you see her again. You must understand everything. It will not do to have her tell you. See—" Kent followed him to the fireplace. From the shelf over the stonework, McTrigger took a picture and gave it to him. It was a snapshot, the picture of a bare-headed man standing in the open with the sun shining on him. A low cry broke from Kent's lips. It was the great gray ghost of a man he had seen in the lightning flare that night from the window of his hiding place in Kedsty's bungalow. "My brother," said McTrigger chokingly. "I loved him. For 40 years we were comrades. And Marette belonged to us, half and half. It was he who killed John Barkley." And then, after a moment in which McTrigger fought to speak steadily, he added, "And it was he, my brother, who also killed Inspector Kedsty." For a matter of seconds there was a dead silence between them. McTrigger looked into the fireplace instead of at Kent. Then he said, "He killed those men, but he didn't murder them, Kent. It couldn't be called that. It was justice, single-man justice, without going to law. If it wasn't for Marette, I wouldn't tell you about it, not the horrible part of it. I don't like to bring it up in my memory. It happened years ago. I was not married then, but my brother was 10 years older than I and had a wife. I think that Marette loves you as Marie loved Donald. And Donald's love was more than that. It was worship. We came into the new mountain country, the three of us, even before the big strikes at Dawson and Bonanza. It was a wild country, a savage country, and there were few women in it. But Marie came with Donald. She was beautiful, with hair and eyes like Marette's. That was the tragedy of it. I won't tell you the details. They were terrible. It happened while Donald and I were out on a hunt. 3 men, white men, remember that, Kent, white men, came out of the north and stopped at the cabin. When we returned, what we found there drove us mad. Marie died in Donald's arms. And leaving her there, alone, we set out after the white-skinned brutes who had destroyed her. Only a blizzard saved them, Kent. Their trail was fresh when the storm came. Had it held off another 2 hours, I, too, would have killed. From that day, Donald and I became man-hunters. We traced the back trail of the 3 friends and discovered who they were. 2 years later, Donald found one of the 3 in the Yukon, and before he killed him, he made him verify the names of the other 2. It was a long search after that, Kent. It has covered 30 years. Donald grew old faster than I, and I knew, after a time, that he was strangely mad. He would be gone for months at a time, always searching for the 2 men. 10 years passed, and then, one day, in the deep of winter, we came on a cabin home that had been stricken with the plague, the smallpox. It was the home of Pierre Radisson and his wife Andrea. Both were dead. But there was a little child still living, almost a babe in arms. We took her, Donald and I. The child was Marette. McTrigger had spoken almost in a monotone. He had not raised his eyes from the ash of the fireplace. But now he looked up suddenly at Kent. "We worshipped her from the beginning," he said, his voice a bit husky. "I hoped that love for her would save Donald. It did, in a way, but it did not cure his madness, his desire for vengeance. We came farther east. We found this marvelous valley, and gold in the mountains, untouched by other men. We built here, and I hoped even more that the glory of this new world we had discovered would help Donald to forget. I married, and my wife loved Marette. We had a child, and then another, and both died. We loved Marette more than ever after that. Anne, my wife, was the daughter of a missioner, and capable of educating Marette up to a certain point. You will find this place filled with all kinds of books, and reading, and music. But the time came when we thought we must send Marette to Montreal. It broke her heart. And then, a long time after—" McTrigger paused a moment, looking into Kent's eyes. "And then, one day Donald came in from Dawson City, terrible in his madness, and told us that he had found his men. One of them was John Barkley, the rich timberman, and the other was Kedsty, inspector of police at Athabasca Landing." Kent made no effort to speak. His amazement, as McTrigger had gone on, was beyond the expression of words. The night held for him a cumulative shock, the discovery that Marette was not dead, but alive, and now the discovery that he, Jim Kent, was no longer a hunted man, and that it was O'Connor, his old comrade, who had run the truth down. With dry lips he simply nodded, urging McTrigger to continue. "I knew what would happen if Donald went after Barkley and Kedsty," said the older man, "and it was impossible to hold him back. He was mad, clean mad. There was just one thing for me to do. I left here first, with the intention of warning the two brutes who had killed Donald's wife. I knew, with the evidence in our hands, they could do nothing but make a getaway. No matter how rich or powerful they were, our evidence was complete, and through many years we had kept track of the movements of our witnesses. I tried to explain to Donald that we could send them to prison, but there was but one thought in his poor sick mind: to kill. I was younger and beat him south. And after that I made my fatal mistake. I thought I was far enough ahead of him to get down to the line of rail and back before he arrived. You see, I figured his love for Marette would take him to Montreal first, and I had made up my mind to tell her everything so that she might understand the necessity of holding him if he went to her. I wrote everything to her and told her to remain in Montreal. How she did that, you know. She set out for the north as soon as she received my letter. McTrigger's shoulders hunched lower. Well, you know what happened, Kent. Donald got ahead of me after all. I came the day after Barkley was killed. I took it as a kind fate that the day preceding the killing I shot a grouse for my dinner, and as the bird was only wounded when I picked it up, I got blood on the sleeves of my coat. I was arrested. Kedsty, everyone, was sure they had the real man. And I kept quiet, except to maintain my innocence. I could say nothing that would turn the law on Donald's trail. After that, things happened quickly. You, my friend, made your false confession to save one who had done you a poor service years ago. Almost simultaneously with that, Marette had come. She came quietly in the night and went straight to Kedsty. She told him everything, showed him the written evidence, telling him this evidence was in the hands of others and would be used if anything happened to her. Her power over him was complete. As the price of her secrecy, she demanded my release, and in that black hour your confession gave Kedsty his opportunity. He knew you were lying. He knew it was Donald who had killed Barkley, yet he was willing to sacrifice you to save himself. And Marette remained in his house, waiting and watching for Donald, while I searched for him on the trails. That is why she secretly lived in Kedsty's house. She knew that Donald would come there sooner or later, if I did not find him and get him away, and she was plotting how to save you. She loved you, Kent, from that first hour she came to you in the hospital, and she tried to exact your freedom also as an added price for her secrecy. But Kedsty had become like a cornered tiger. If he freed you, he saw his whole world crumbling under his feet. He, too, went a little mad, I think. He told Marette that he would not free you, that he would go to the hangman first. Then, Kent, came the night of your freedom, and a little later Donald came to Kedsty's home. It was he whom you saw that night out in the storm. He entered and killed Kedsty. Something dragged Marette down to the room that night. She found Kedsty in his chair, dead. Donald was gone. It was then that you found her there. Kent, she loved you, and you will never know how her heart bled when she let you think that she had killed Kedsty. She has told me everything. It was her fear for Donald, her desire to keep all possible suspicion from him until he was safe, that compelled her not to confide even in you. Later, when she knew that Donald must be safe, she was going to tell you. And then you were separated at the chute. McTrigger paused, and Kent saw him choke back a grief that was still like the fresh cut of a knife in his heart. And O'Connor found out all this? McTrigger nodded. Yes. He defied Kedsty's command to go to Fort Simpson and was on his way back to Athabasca Landing when he found my brother. It is strange how all things happened, Kent, but I guess God must have meant it that way. Donald was dying, and in dying, for a space, his old reason returned to him. It was from him, before he died, that O'Connor learned everything. The story is known everywhere now. It is marvelous that you did not hear—" There came an interruption, the opening of a door. Anne McTrigger stood looking at them, where a little time before she had disappeared with Marette. There was a glad smile in her face. Her dark eyes were glowing with a new happiness. First they rested on McTrigger's face, and then on Kent's. "Marette is much better," she said in her soft voice. "She is waiting to see you, Monsieur Kent. Will you come now?" Like one in a dream, Kent went toward her. He picked up his pack, for with its precious contents it had become to him like his own flesh and blood. And as the woman led the way and Kent followed her, McTrigger did not move from the fireplace. In a little while Anne McTrigger came back into the room. Her beautiful eyes were aglow. She was smiling softly, and putting her arms about the shoulders of the man at the fireplace, she whispered, "I have looked at the night through the window, Malcolm. I think that the stars are bigger and brighter than they have been in a long time. And the Watcher seems like a living God up in the sky. Come, please." She took his hand, and Malcolm went with her. Over their heads burned a glory of stars. The wind came gently up the valley, cool with the freshness of the mountain tops, sweet with the smell of meadow and flowers. And when the woman pointed through the glow, Malcolm McTrigger looked up at the Watcher, and for an instant he fancied that he saw what she had seen, something that was life instead of death, a glow of understanding and of triumph in the mighty face of stone above the lace mists of the clouds. For a long time they walked on, and deep in the heart of the woman a voice cried out again and again that the Watcher knew, and that it was a living joy she saw up there, for up to that unmoving and voiceless God of the mountains she had cried and laughed and sung, and even prayed. And with her Marette had also done these things, until at last the pulse and beat of women's souls had given a spirit to a form of rock. Back in the chateau which Malcolm McTrigger and his brother Donald had built of logs, in a room whose windows faced the Watcher himself, Marette was unveiling the last of mystery for Jim Kent. And this, too, was her hour of triumph. Her lips were red and warm with the flush brought there by Kent's love. Her face was like the wild roses he had crushed under his feet all that day. For in this hour the world had come to her and had prostrated itself at her feet. The sacred contents of the pack were in her lap as she leaned back in the great blanketed and pillowed chair that had been her invalid's nest for many days. But it was an invalid's nest no longer. The floods of life were pounding through her body again, and in that hour when Malcolm McTrigger and his wife were gone, Kent looked upon the miracle of its change. And now Marette gave to him a little packet, and while Kent opened it, she raised both hands to her head, and unbound her hair, so that it fell about her in shining and glorious confusion. Kent, unwrapping a last bit of tissue paper, found in his hands a long tress of hair. "See, Jeems, it has grown fast since I cut it that night." She leaned a little toward him, parting her hair with slim, white fingers, so that he saw again where the hair had been clipped the night of Kedsty's death. And then she said, "You may keep it always if you want to, Jeems, for I cut it from my head when I left you in the room below, and when you almost believed I had killed Kedsty. It was this." She gave him another packet, and her lips tightened a little as Kent unwrapped it, and another tress of hair shimmered in the lamp glow. "That was Father Donald's," she whispered. It was all he had left of Marie, his wife. And that night, when Kedsty died—" "I understand," cried Kent, stopping her. "He choked Kedsty with it until he was dead. And when I found it around Kedsty's neck, you let me think it was yours, to save Father Donald." She nodded. "Yes, Jeems. If the police had come, they would have thought I was guilty. I planned to let them think so until Father Donald was safe. But all the time I had here in my breast this other tress, which would prove that I was innocent when the time came. And now, Jeems—" She smiled at him again and reached out her hands. "Oh, I feel so strong! And I want to take you out now, and show you my valley. Jeems, our valley, yours and mine, in the starlight. Not tomorrow, Jeems, but tonight. Now." A little later the Watcher looked down on them, even as it had looked down on another man and another woman who had preceded them. But the stars were bigger and brighter, and the white cap of snow that rested on the Watcher's head like a crown caught the faint gleam of a far-away light, and after that, slowly and wonderfully, other snow-crusted mountain-tops caught that greeting radiance of the moon. But it was the Watcher who stood out like a mighty god among them all, and when they came to the elbow in the plain, Marette drew Kent down beside her on a great flat rock, and laughed softly as she held his hand tightly in her lap. "Always, from a little child, I have sat and played on this rock, with the Watcher looking, like that," she said in a low voice. "I have grown to love him, Jeems, and I have always believed that he was gazing off there, night and day, into the east, watching for something that was coming to me. Now I know. It was you, Jeems. And, Jeems, when I was away, down there in the big city—" Her fingers gripped his thumb in their old way, and Kent waited. "It was the Watcher that made me want to come home most of all," she went on, a bit of tremble in her voice. "Oh, I grew lonely for him, and I could see him in my dreams at night, watching, 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 and sometimes even calling me. Jeems, do you see that hump on his left shoulder, like a great epaulet?" "Yes, I see," said Kent. "Beyond that, on a straight line from here, hundreds of miles away, are Dawson City, the Yukon, the big gold country, men, women, civilization. Father Malcolm and Father Donald have never found but one trail to this side of the mountains, and I have been over it 3 times, to Dawson. But the Watcher's back is on those things. Sometimes I imagine it was he who built those great ramparts through which few men come. He wants this valley alone. And so do I. Alone with you, and with my people." Kent drew her close in his arms. "When you are stronger," he whispered, "we will go over that hidden trail together, past the Watcher, toward Dawson. For it must be that over there we will find a missioner." He paused. "Please go on, Jeems." "And you will be my wife." "Yes, yes, Jeems, forever and ever. But, Jeems—" Her arms crept up about his neck. "Very soon it will be the 1st of August." "Yes." "And in that month there come through the mountains each year a man and a woman to visit us, Mother Anne's father and mother. And Mother Anne's father—" "Yes." "Is a missioner, Jeems." And Kent, looking up in this hour of his triumph and joy, believed that in the Watcher's face he caught for an instant the passing radiance of a smile. The End. End of chapter 26. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood.